to start this International Development Select Committee meeting when we have the pleasure of not one but two permanent undersecretaries from FCDO in front of us, and also Corin Robertson, who is Finance Director. Thank you very much. We've got a wide range of questions, as you can imagine. But first of all, if it's not inappropriate, could I start, Sir Philip, by saying it has been an absolute pleasure to work with you, engage with you, and meet with you over your tenure. You came in at probably the most, I don't know how to say it, challenging time for FCDO, and you've tried really hard to steer a relatively stable passage for the team and for the governments that you have worked under, and it's been a great privilege to have you in that role. And when is it? I think this is your last gig, isn't it, that you're leaving us?
Thank you very much, Jan. I really appreciate those remarks and the sentiment that lies behind them. I think this is my last ever, certainly in this role, select committee appearance. An announcement on my successor is imminent, and that will also determine exactly when I step down, probably later this month. So this is probably my last select committee appearance.
Well, we wish you well. Please, you stay a friend to this committee. And the service that you have given has been absolutely fantastic, and sort of the one thing that I'm really grateful for is you've always been very honest and upfront in your engagements, not only with this committee but with Parliament, and that's something that we really value, so thank you very, very much. And on that, could I ask each of you to sort of formally introduce yourselves, and then we'll start with the questions. So, Sir Philip.
So, thank you, Jan. I'm Philip Barton. I'm the Permanent Under-Secretary of the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, and maybe Jan, I could just add congratulations to you on your re-election. Congratulations to all of the committee on joining the committee, and it's looking at all of your CVs, it's great to see so many people with expertise and experience in the development sector.
Yeah, we're blessed as a committee. Thank you.
I'm Nick Dyer. I'm the second permanent Undersecretary at the FCDO, and I lead on our development portfolio.
And Corin?
I'm Corin Robertson, Director General for Finance and Corporate, so Chief Operating Officer at FCDO.
Corin, because you're a late addition, we haven't got questions specific to you, but please do jump in if that's okay. No, but our first set of questions are from Sam.
Yeah, it's mainly addressed to you, Sir Philip, based on your tenure as the first permanent Under-Secretary. Firstly, just what do you consider to be the primary benefits and also costs of the merger with DFID and the Foreign Office?
So I think the idea behind the merger was to achieve more for the UK internationally by being more integrated. Some of that was around doing diplomacy and development in one department. Some of it was around wider integration of under the last government of the overall international effort under the policy framework of the integrated review. And so it's how you achieve more, both in terms of a headquarters effort and making joined up policy making and policy decisions, but also the effort on the ground through our global network, and the sort of thing that you can see that actually I think bringing benefits, and some of it's illustrated in the NAO's report on the mergers. For example, responding to a sudden onset crisis, so the earthquake in Turkey and northeast Syria a couple of years ago. We had a much more integrated response, doing both the immediate humanitarian side, which in the past would have been done on the DFID side, but also with the consular and political response. Similarly, if you look at, for example, at work we do in a place, terrible tragedy in a place like Sudan, some of that is around our ability to secure access for humanitarian agencies, and that requires political influence. And I think we are much better at basically putting on the table both our deep development expertise and ability to work with agencies, but also our diplomatic influence through the diplomatic side. I'm not going to duck the part on costs, and I can go into detail as I can. I'll just say two things. I mean, the sort of financial cost, not huge. I think we've reported in successive annual reports. I think from memory the headline figure was 24 24 million, and then there's some costs, things we would have had to do as individual departments around modernising our IT and HR, slightly hard to disentangle. It is true that doing a merger is all, if any organisation is going to be complicated and complex, and there is a disruption factor as you basically bring teams together. So there was a period in late 2020 into 2021 where we were going through the process of selecting new leadership and putting in place the merged teams, and that had a bit of an impact on our ability to deliver in that period.
So Philip, by costs, I don't think Sam was necessarily just talking about money. This committee has never taken a position on whether the government should or shouldn't do the merger, because that's obviously for the governments. But we were very clear that the timing of the merger was pretty catastrophic. I mean, let us remember, it was a new government, it was COVID, there was much upheaval in the world, and we were, reliably told off the record that it was because the Prime Minister was meddling too much in Brexit, and they wanted to throw him a bone to get him away from interfering on the Brexit negotiations. What do you think the costs were of the timing of making that decision to merge the two departments?
So, I mean, we looked at this. I think the NAO also looked at it. So, and actually, I think we put this in our witness statements to the COVID inquiry. I don't think I would say that it affected the government and the one department's ability, for example, to respond to the pandemic.
But Afghanistan withdrawal, for example.
Let me come on to that. So, what I would say is, mergers are always complicated and difficult, and doing it in the course of a global pandemic, not least when you can't meet in person, just bring together two teams into one team, definitely made it harder and probably more complicated and took longer to implement. I think on Afghanistan, it's very, very hard to know what the counterfactual would have been. What would have happened if there hadn't been a merger? Could the response have been different? It was a very, very, very significant and challenging situation, very demanding for any part of government and for all governments around the world responding in the way that we were to deal with. And I recognise, and I've said, threw up some capability gaps and things that we needed to be better at. There were some specific things which we wouldn't have been there if it hadn't been for the merger around still having two IT systems which weren't fully integrated at that point, which made some of the way in which we managed information more difficult than they would have been otherwise. But I don't want to exaggerate that, Chair, because I think the single biggest thing was the scale and complexity of the crisis we were responding to.
And what about the cost to our international reputation? I mean, you mentioned that things were done online. What was done online was your staff were told online that they had to cut programmes, and they were sending emails or at best Zoom calls to people that were dependent on us for their programme delivery, and just telling them they were being shut, some with as short as 3 days notice, and then some catastrophic decisions. So, for example, I think it was 97% of the funding to the UNFPA was cut with less than a week's notice, they told us in evidence.
So Chair, I think DFID was a fantastic global brand. You as the committee knew that and acknowledged that, and therefore a change to a single department was controversial around the world, and at least in some parts people had a negative reaction to it. But my view is, and you talked about this, actually the reduction in the overall size of our budget, which wasn't related to the merger, came later, actually did more damage. And you've illustrated that. It meant that we were having to cut in 2021 very significantly our programmes and either not do things we said we're going to do, or actually in some cases close down or significantly reduce things we were already involved in at very short notice, because the scale of the cuts gave us no choice, and that definitely did serious damage to our reputation. In some places it meant we were seen as an unreliable partner.
You said that you presented the cuts as different from the merger. Maybe this is a question to Nick Dyer, if you don't mind. If DFID was still an independent department, would you have had more leverage to argue against those cuts?
I'm not sure that that would be the case. In pure Whitehall terms, I mean, to be honest, the FCO, the FCDO has got more seniority across the Whitehall firmament, and I think probably you were just as in a strong position to argue the case within the FCDO as we were in, or could have been in DFID. And I think the cut was due as much, the government said at the time, due to the additional costs of COVID and the fiscal costs that they couldn't absorb and had to find cuts accordingly. I very much agree with Philip that the cuts were the most damaging part of what's happened over the last few years. Particularly, they happened at scale at very short notice, and it was very difficult to.
And you don't think having a cabinet member at that time who could have been arguing against those cuts would have made any difference?
I mean, it's very difficult to judge and to tell.
Thank you. Back to Sam.
No, I was going to ask. So I appreciate your comment on the cuts. What sort of damage do you think that did to the UK's global brand? Both the cuts, but also the loss of DFID, which I think is fair to say was the envy of the world, and certainly, and I've previously worked in international. I visited foreign embassies all over the world, where people spoke very positively about the UK and about our role. Do you see any costs to our global reputation?
So I think it's worth recognising. We are still this government's policy spending 0.5 of GNI on ODA. That still makes us a very, very significant bonus. So there's been no change in the overall level since the original decision to step down from 0.7. And I think if you look at the international comparisons, we're in pretty good company at that level. And I think people have digested the change from us being a 0.7 donor to being a 0.5 donor for now until the fiscal situation allows an increase. And I think when I travel around the world, including to countries which where DFID had a presence, and I see good integration now in our missions between ex-FCO and ex-DFID teams, and very good partnership both with other internationals operating in those countries, but also with the countries themselves and their officials. Actually, I think people are sort of getting on with engaging with the UK and UK officials, and I don't think there's an ongoing cost to the fact we're now a merged department rather than two separate departments in the way we do our work, including on the development side.
Monica? Sorry, Monica, and then someone else made a noise.
Just to push you on the separation between the two, has that meant a loss of focus for the development part of it? And so, for example, is it subsumed by perhaps UK commercial interests, and that focus has gone?
I think Nick should have, but I think on the second point, it's in the legislation. Primary purpose has to be poverty reduction. That remains absolutely the case, and we are really clear and strong about that, and will not move away from that. As I say, it's in the legislation, so it's a legal obligation. On the focus, and Chair, apologies, you've heard this before, but we recognised a couple of years in that something I would have preferred to have from the outset, a second permanent secretary with a deep development background acting as alongside me as a horizontal capability, so not so much as my deputy as a horizontal capability, was really going to help us. And Nick, you should perhaps say a little bit about what you've done over the last year and a half on giving us development focus.
Yeah. Russia's invasion of Ukraine was the moment where I recognised what the benefits of the merger could be, because I think at that time, bringing the political and the development teams together, I generally think that we made better decisions quicker and had better outcomes because of it. So I could see the benefits, but I've always been worried. I was always worried at the point of merge about three things. One was the visibility of our development voice within the merged FCDO. The second was how we managed accountabilities, because that was not very clear. And the third was a reduction in our capability, because frankly quite a lot of people left at the point of the merger, and we undermined our development capability. Now, I mean, I think I would like to say my appointment in June 2023 went a long way to fix the first two, about visibility and accountability, because I've put in place additional accountability mechanisms to ensure that I can see what's going on in terms of overspend and over accountability, in terms of internal governance, and externally and internally, people now know who to go to talk about development if they want to, in terms of official level, which is myself and the teams that I work with. On the capability, I think that's a longer term challenge. So we did lose about 20% of our professional capability just after the merger. If you look at our recruitments now, about 60% of all the development advisory roles in 2024 this year haven't been filled because we haven't got enough people in the business to be able to fill them. So we are going through a process of how do we recreate and rebuild our capability.
On that particular point, and I forget the exact wording, wasn't it a change that it couldn't be overseas nationals that could take the roles, the development roles, whereas it was before the merger? And is that having any impact?
There has been a change in that the FCDO is both a reserved department, which means you have to be a UK national, and also you require development vetting to be able to work in the FCDO.
The development vetting I'm happy with, but
what that has done is that has prevented us from recruiting non-UK nationals as from now, as from the point of that decision. But of our non-UK nationals who are in the organisation, we are still offering them opportunities.
Yeah, but I'm specifically asking, has that hampered the recruitment process? Is that why we've got so many vacancies?
No, it hasn't. Not that specifically.
So why have we got so many vacancies?
Well, because of the...
is that the reputational damage? Is that one of the costs that we were asking about?
We haven't recruited. What we've focused on principally in terms of rebuilding our professional capability is bringing people across in the organisation into professional jobs. So we have had I think there's been about 200 of our new professional staff we have built internally. So we've brought people into those roles from our existing complement. We are now starting to recruit externally. We weren't recruiting externally previously, so we are now starting to recruit externally. We've also got the agreement of the Treasury to increase the number of development staff we can bring into the organisation. So we're going to bring in an additional 200 professional staff.
So has the Treasury put a hold on that?
It is more that there were workforce controls across the whole of the civil service, which meant we had a control on our overall workforce costs, but in a sense, if it's funded on the development side through ODA, there was an exemption, so we can increase that. That's what Nick's referring to.
So sorry to dig into this a little bit. So that was for new posts or replacement posts that you had a hold on? So if someone left, could you fill their post, or was that on hold as well?
So this is new posts. So we have...
So I think it's about 20% of people left because of the merger. Yeah. So you were able to backfill those. They weren't under the Treasury hold, or you just internally filled them.
Well, there was a certain amount of internal filling. There was a certain amount of internal restructuring that went on alongside the merger, and also we have now got a agreement from the Treasury that we can uplift by an additional 200 to bring new people into the organisation on the development side.
So does those 250, does that get you back to the capacity that you were at? Or is that in addition to where you were?
It's complicated. I mean, it partly depends...
Seemingly so.
Well, it is. It partly depends on the theme, what areas you're looking at. Our bigger problem was we lost a lot of seniority. So many of the posts that we lost at the point of merger were our most senior experienced. So
because of the merger, the experienced people didn't want to be involved in what was going on.
There was a certain amount of that going on. So we are bringing new people.
What a dreadful waste of incredibly talented people. And my apologies to them, because they were our absolute international flagship and did phenomenal work. So that pains me to hear that. Thank you. David, unless... Monica, did you want to come back in?
I'll do just on that. On a visit to Kenya early last year, one of two people said to me, one of whom was American actually, the British, we miss them. Could you tell me, is that capability, is that money, or is that brand?
Sorry, I missed the question.
So two people involved in international development in Kenya, in aid work in Kenya, said to me, the British, we miss them. Now, one of them was American, one of them was local. Is that because of brand? Is that because of capability, as you've outlined, or is that because of money?
I haven't got the money, I haven't got the numbers in front of me. It's probably fair to say that our bilateral programme to Kenya has probably reduced over the last couple of years, because it has across the whole of our country portfolio, because it's come down quite significantly. But I think when people say they miss the UK voice, I think as much they're talking about the ideas and the propositions and the engagement of the UK in international events and international discussions. And I do think that has taken a step back over the last few years, because we have been very focused internally and we are now trying to rebuild and engage externally. So, for instance, on the whole global financial architecture debate, we are very engaged and energised and participate in all the various debates to try and get movement in getting reforms in the World Bank and the various other banks.
David Reid.
Thank you, Chair. Nick, so Corin, thank you very much for being with us today. And my employment chair, congratulating you and thank you for your many decades of service to our country. So I'd like to start high level and then dive into detail. I think it's fair to say in recent years that the UK doing international development has become quite contentious to the British public, and especially around cost of living crisis. UK people largely don't really understand how or why their money is being spent overseas. And I think, having been on this committee for the last few months, what I've struggled to understand is that high-level view of why we do international development, and more importantly, why does that matter to the UK population? So, to all three of you, would you be able to sort of give a high-level view on why you think we do international development?
So, I'd say two things. One is, I do think it's reflected in what you see when, for example, the DEC puts out an appeal and the British public are very generous. I do think there's something about us as a country helping the least fortunate in the world. As an act of generosity, and I think people do support that, and the British public support and understand that, and put their hands in their own pockets at times of acute need, as I say, things like DEC appeals. The second thing I would say is, if you look at quite a lot of the issues that impact the UK and indeed the government's agenda around missions and foundations, I don't exaggerate this, but some of them, you go to the root cause, is actually development assistance, although its aim, its primary purpose has to be, rightly is, poverty reduction, can be positively impacted by what we are doing overseas. So I would cite those two dual reasons in answer to your question.
Thanks. Partly depends who I'm talking to, because I say that generally because different people want to hear different things or would be persuaded by different arguments. I would start by saying this is part of the country we want to be in terms of helping those who are more unfortunate than us, and that's how we view ourselves, and that's what we want to do in terms of reducing poverty and helping address inequality and the most marginalised. Second, I think it's part of our foreign policy geopolitical interests to work on development. It's part of it is a foreign policy objective. If we want to achieve our wider foreign policy objectives, we need to ensure that the Global South trust us and think we're on their side. And part of our development work is part of demonstrating to the poorest countries that we can be good partners and work with them to help solve the problems that they identify themselves. And that's what good partnership is about. And thirdly, like Philip, I do think this is in part an argument around ensuring that we are helping the UK. And I'd say that in two thoughts. One is, if you want to drive UK growth, which is one of the missions of government, you can't do that just domestically. You've got to look at the markets of today, US, Europe, China to some extent, but also the markets of the future. And the markets of the future are Nigeria, they're Indonesia, they are countries in the global south. Migration. I mean, migration has been driven by climate, by conflict, by the crises around the world, and development is about the long-term addressing of the drivers of migration. So if you want to address the core challenges that is faced in the UK, each of them have a development an international dimension, and most of them have a development dimension to them as well.
So I think, if I'm being completely honest, I think this is part of the problem. I completely understand all the arguments you're making, and I agree with many of them, but I'm sure many people on the committee have had the same problem, knocking on doors, because there isn't that short, snappy answer of why we're spending 0.5 of GNI of taxpayers' money on this. It becomes quite unpalatable to people. And I think as a country, we need to do much better in sort of drawing that in and creating that narrative before diving into the detail and explaining why we're doing these things. And I think the point around migration is going to be a significant one going forwards. Moving on to the new government then, have they been fairly clear with the priorities for the development part of the FCDO?
I would start with the manifesto. I think the manifesto is pretty clear. World free of poverty on a livable planet. And I think that signals two things. One is the interconnection between poverty reduction and climate change, which I think most of us would agree with. The other is, and most people will know that also is a strapline of the World Bank, which is about the importance of the multilateralism and the multilateral system. I think the other starting point of the government is a recognition that in the 14 years where they've been out of government, the world has changed quite significantly. It is more multipolar, contested. The issues around climate, growth, jobs are more important. Issues around technology. So there's a recognition about the changing landscape. I would point at two. I mean, you want to ask the minister herself when she comes after here, and I don't particularly want to talk for her. But I would point at two speeches that have recently been made. One is her speech at Chatham House, where she talks about how to modernise international development. She talks there about partnerships, multilateralism, and working with UK expertise. And the other is the Foreign Secretary's speech on climate and nature, where he made a very strong pitch about the importance of addressing the climate change and helping countries adapt to climate change, and also the nature challenge. So, I mean, clearly, that alongside growth and jobs is going to be particularly important. But I'm sure the minister will expand on that.
Thank you.
So, linked very closely to that, and one for Corin. What are your priorities going to be going into the spending review negotiations?
So across the FCDO, our priorities are going to be to ensure we can secure the resources to deliver the Foreign Secretary's objectives and what we need to deliver in the world. So to maintain our the platform that we provide for the whole of government overseas, because the FCDO provides that platform for the whole of government. So ensuring we can maintain and protect that, and to ensure that we've got the workforce and the resources we need in order to deliver the development strategy and the whole of our FCDO objectives for HMG.
Thank you.
And
David, brief.
Very brief. Moving on from the last government to the new government, are those priorities quite different, and is there going to be quite significant changes that you're going to have to make to put those points across?
So the Foreign Secretary has sort of set out the Prime Minister has clearly set out his priorities and the missions and foundations for government, and the Foreign Secretary has been clear about where his priorities are as part of that. He's also commissioned a series of reviews for which he'll be looking at and sort of as part of when we go into the spending review negotiations, thinking about where to prioritise those negotiations to secure the resources for the outer years of the spending review period.
Thank
you very
David
much.
Mandel.
Obviously, we've got a number of very significant replenishments coming up to existing multilateral arrangements, Global Fund, Gavi. Where do you think that the balance currently is sitting with between bilateral and multilateralism, which you referred to, Nick, and are the resources there to be able to support even previously expected or aspirations?
Our current multilateral share is about 35% on average of our spend, and you will have seen just before the Christmas break we made 2 replenishment announcements, one to IDA 21 where we did a 40% uplift, and the second was replenishment to the WHO. So we had to make those decisions in advance of the spending round. Our commitments to the next big 2 are going to be Gavi and the Global Fund. We're going to have to do those after the spending round because we want to take into account what the funding arrangements are looking like. But of course, you know, we know what our budget's broadly. We know what the budget's going to be. It's going to be we know it's going to be 0.5. So the government's made it clear that they're going to stick to 0.5 until fiscal circumstances change. Then there are a number of moving parts within that. One is, of course, in-donor refugee costs and how big those will be. And then how much does the FCDO get in terms of its share? We would like in the SR, as we have done in the past, to increase the share of the budget that comes to FCDO. And then every choice you make has a trade-off within the spending round. And in effect, what we give bilaterally is the residual of all those other decisions.
I'm going to have to, just because of time,
Sure.
I'm going to have to move on to
Okay.
Noah, if that's okay. And could I ask, it is fascinating, but
Short
you can
answers.
always follow up in writing.
Fine.
Noah.
Well, let's do that over now, please.
So if we could get a follow-up in writing with more details to David Mundell's question, please. Noah.
Nick, we can touch briefly on that again, but to Nick and also Corin, I think, on this question. You're the ODA spender of last resort, so do you think this hinders the department's ability to formulate and deliver long-term development programmes?
In the past, no, because we always benefited from it. So when G&I grew, we always got more resource. Of course, the last few years where we've had the unexpected increases in donor refugee costs, it's been quite damaging for us. And I suppose the question to ask is whether it still suits us to be the donor of last resort. I think it does, because the issue is predictability. So if you want long-term partnerships, you've got to have predictable funding. We got really badly caught out in 2022 where we had to make in-year cuts. We undermined our predictability. But we are now managing our budget in a way where we're saying to our country programmes, or I'm saying, 80% will be predictable, 20% you've got to manage because we may ask for it back in terms of uncertainty.
Nick, were those 2022 in-year costs because of the refugee costs?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So we can build. We are now building in our own way of managing our budgets to build in predictability, because those long-term partnerships are absolutely critical to the way we want to do our development.
Okay, and do you think those in-donor refugee costs, that, what is it, 27.9% in 2023 of ODA, do you think that is an effective way of addressing the sustainable development goals?
Well, it's a valid way of spending your ODA because it's part of the DAC rules. The only thing I would say on it is, regardless of what you think about it, is that the Home Secretary and the Home Office are now committed to bring down those costs by addressing the biggest proportion of them, which is the hotel costs, but also to try and get people, reduce the backlog and get people through the system quicker. So my expectation is that those costs will start to come down. But how quickly and how fast is subject to a number of moving parts.
David Taylor?
Just wanted to briefly draw a comparison with the Dutch government, as I understand it, have a 10% cap on in-donor refugee costs. Would that help your department have more predictability over aid spending if that was brought in the UK?
I mean, clearly, if there was a cap, it would improve our predictability. But without a cap, where there isn't one, there are other ways where we can build in our own predictability, as I just explained. And I think that's the way that we've chosen to approach it because of the choices that have been made across the government and from the Treasury.
Thank you, Alice.
Thanks very much. Just expanding on some specific areas of spend, humanitarian and also gender equality I wanted to ask about.
You spoke about some areas where there is some predictability, but obviously in humanitarian assistance that is not so clear. So how do you anticipate what might happen and allocate contingency? For example, the 50 million that's just been allocated to Syria, where does that come from, and how what impact does that have on the predictability of how you are spending your money?
Well, there are two choices to make on the humanitarian side, which we will have to discuss with ministers as we go forward. One is whether you want to set aside as part of your budget a particular proportion for humanitarian spend. So in the period in the annual report that we're talking about, we set aside £1 billion for our humanitarian response, and we allocated it according to need and severity. So we had a very predictable humanitarian allocation, and then we actually reintroduced the crisis reserve that year as well, which was £50 million, which was a lot lower than previous years, but it's what we felt we could afford.
What
at the
was
time.
it previously? I want to say it was 500 before all that started.
It was the highest we got to was 200 was the actual humanitarian reserve that we set aside, and we said it could go up to 500 by reallocating programs
so
if needed.
Cut by 90%.
Yeah, I mean, it was a big cut. Yeah. So I mean, I would say that we've been reasonably predictable. What you've seen recently, so we've had an increase in funding to Syria. We announced a big funding to Syria, and we announced a big increase to Sudan recently. What tends to happen towards the end of a year is that we get underspends from programs, and we recycle those back into the humanitarian, which is what helped us drive our Sudan uplift.
And given how many conflicts there are in the world and how much need there is for spending, do you think you're going to have similar levels of underspend this year?
Well, this year the two things are happening. One is there have been some underspends. The other is actually because of expected GNI growth and also Home Office expected reductions in the spend. The CST has, subject to parliamentary approval, allocated an additional £540 million to FCDO for this financial year for additional spending. So actually we used part of that for the Syria uplift.
Is that contingent on GNI growth? Because it's not going that well at the moment, is it?
It's based on the allocations based on nominal GNI. So that is the forecast, and that is the allocation that the CST has, subject to Parliament's agreement, to increase our budget.
Okay, I have two specific questions on two areas of funding. I'll do them together just for time. In the 2023 statistics showed that the bilateral ODA for humanitarian support fell by roughly 20% from 2022, and it's where we've seen big cuts. What was the justification for that cut? And can I also just ask you on gender equality as well, because we know that's meant to be a priority within spending, but we saw between 2019 and 2021 ODA spending with a focus on gender equality halved. So do you feel like the FCDO took its eye off the ball when it came to women and girls?
In terms of we have seen cuts both thematically and geographically across the whole of our business because of the 3 rounds of cuts that we have experienced over the last 4 years. And that is just an inevitable part of our experience. And on the humanitarian side, I mean, only, 45% of the global humanitarian appeals were funded last year. I mean, there's a massive shortfall globally, not only in terms of our funding, but everybody else's funding as well. And similarly on girls and women, I mean, there's been a cut thematically across the whole of the piece. Have we taken our eye off the ball? I would argue, and I'm sure that the Minister, when she comes later, and you should ask her this question, she's got a very strong commitment to women and girls. And
I was asking more historically, because I think we'd seen that under the previous government, that aid really falling. So I'm just, were people saying we should be investing more in this area, and it just wasn't happening?
So I'll answer that because Nick wasn't in his role. Yeah. In the 2019 to 2001, that is through the step down from 0.7 to 0.5. Can't actually remember the exact number of billions it was overnight we had to take out of our budget. We had a conversation with ministers about and the foreign secretaries today about the overall strategy and the things, and then we set out the choices ministers could make within the very significantly reduced envelope. We did that with having our best Dyer to value for money and how far programs were along, but inevitably, I don't think it was taking it off the ball. It was just the only way to make the sums add up against a really significant reduction in the budget.
Thank you. Yeah. I guess that sometimes it feels like because it's mainstream gender, is anyone actually really looking at aggregate impact on women and girls across all the cuts? But we can leave it there for now.
We did. I mean, it's a legitimate question. We did our best, including doing our best to look at the equality impacts of the overall approach. But I understand what you're saying in terms of the aggregate, not just the women's and girls programmes.
I'm pulling it out of my memory banks. I'm pretty sure the committee did do that work and found out that women and girls were disproportionately cut, people with disabilities even more so, and the intersection of all of those, the most vulnerable people got pretty much the worst cuts. So it was not a good time for this country and its development work. Monica.
This. Me. You. Okay. Excuse me. I was focused on another question. So to Nick, so ODA has been cut again for the 24-25 budget to 13.7 billion, which is a reduction of 1.6 billion from the total 2023 ODA spend. So where will the impact of this reduction be felt?
Whilst I recognise the overall figure of the G&I reduction, because in 2023 there was a exceptional end-of-year uplift in the budget given by the former government of 1.5 billion, so we got to 0.58 of G&I, and it has come down to 0.5%. But actually the FCDO budget, when you add back the CST's uplift that he has approved, subject to parliamentary approval, actually the FCDO budget ODA programme budget, compared to 2023, actually has gone up. So our budget has not been cut. If anything, our budget has gone up a bit by about £200 to £300 million. And that is a consequence because of the G&I growth, and it's also a consequence of in-donor refugee costs coming down. So there are two things going on. So it's net of the in-donor refugee costs is the figure that I like to look at, because that is what leaves the residual budget for departments to actually spend in terms of discretionary ODA.
Do you know what balance that is between the in-country refugee costs going down and G&I going up? Do you know how that is?
I haven't got that in front of me. I'd have to get back to you on that.
Would be grateful if you did. Thank you.
Can I also ask another question, just coming back to priorities? I noticed also that there was a decline in spend on the eradication of poverty. Is, from what you've just said about the Minister's priorities, and again we can ask her when she comes, but is it your expectation that the objectives for development is going to be on the eradication of global poverty again? A renewed focus?
I don't recognise your statement that spending on eradication of poverty has gone down, because in effect everything that we do is about reducing poverty, and there's a line of sight between our spend and poverty reduction, and that's what we have to justify in order to get the spend under the International Development Act.
I think there was a decline from 2019 to aid to least developed countries, which went significantly down, as you would expect, in 2021, but then continued to go down into 2023.
Okay, so you're talking about the poorest. You're talking about the balance between
extreme poverty and the middle income countries.
Yeah,
so
okay.
Less spent
yeah. The thing to understand with the middle income spend, quite a lot of that middle income spend is about supporting refugees who are fleeing crises or persecution. So our work in Jordan, our work in Turkey, our work in Ukraine, is all related to sort of conflict and refugee support. So, the statistics don't tell you the full story about what's going on in terms of who you're supporting and what you're doing when you just look at the raw income statistics.
So the eradication of extreme poverty will be a continued objective under this.
The eradication of poverty reduction is a principal requirement of the International Development Act. So yes, that will remain.
Thank you.
Thank you. Brian.
Keep you on the spot, if that's all right. The budget commits to bringing down asylum costs. That includes no tangible commitment to how this will be achieved. Are the FCDO and Home Office in regular communication about the management of ODA in donor refugee costs?
We are reliant on the Home Office to manage the asylum system. What we have put in place is a system whereby we now get monthly forecasts from the Home Office on their projections on their spend. So that's something that we introduced, I can't remember exactly when, but so there is a process now where we've got more visibility about their forecasts, which helps us manage our budget.
Okay, so and leading on from that, and this may be something that is of interest, are there any planned milestones or targets in place to reduce the costs of refugees? And I want to chuck in on top of this, these are some of my own thoughts, especially allowing asylum seekers to work while their applications are underway, perhaps with the use of ankle tags until their status is known, thus helping both with their mental health and the cost to the exchequer of their accommodation. So a kind of win-win. And I'm just wondering, would that help? And could you kind of throw such ideas to the Home Office and say, think about this?
Well, I'm sure the Home Office have looked at all options and policies, but ultimately decisions like that are in the hands of the Home Office, not for us. But clearly anything that brings down the costs would be helpful to us.
Could I push you on Brian's specific point, which was, are there any planned milestones or targets in place to reduce these costs? And it is important, because I think we were I'll say we were sold a pup at the budget, because we were told that because asylum costs were coming down, that would mean there'd be more ODA to spend on alleviation of poverty. And whilst of course I want that to happen, I'm not seeing that as a short-term gain. So in your monthly meetings, are you seeing those costs going down, or are they increasing? And what milestones and targets have you put in place?
I am not aware of any formal milestones and targets, but my expectation, not least because of the commitments made by the Home Office to reduce the backlog, because to bring the backlog down is going to be important, but also to reduce accommodation costs, because hotel costs are 50% of the asylum cost. My expectation would be that those costs will start coming down. But it is really uncertain, because it depends on how many people are applying for asylum.
And you didn't answer my point. So in the monthly meetings, have you seen a reduction?
No, sorry, I did. Sorry, if I wasn't clear, no, I have not seen those milestones like that.
You haven't seen a reduction in costs?
I haven't seen any milestones predicting reductions in costs. We are seeing costs coming down. That's why we had a partial uplift in our funding this year from the Treasury.
So these month-on-month meetings, you're seeing the cost of asylum seekers in country dropping?
That is, I haven't seen the cost in the last, I haven't seen them recently, but the implication of what is happening in our budget is, yes, those costs are starting to come down.
You haven't seen them. What, you haven't seen them?
I haven't seen the latest monthly forecast.
That's a bit odd, because it's your budget.
I know, but I mean my team, our finance team, will have seen them, but I haven't personally seen them myself.
Corin, your money. Can you answer that?
I haven't got the figure on the asylum costs coming down.
I'm quite incredulous on this, because this is your potential to deliver your commitments, and you don't know what your budget is still. So we're still expecting the cost to come down, but I mean, where's the incentive for the Home Office to actually do this? I mean, if it was my money, if it's coming out of my pocket, I would be screaming about this.
The overall cost is a function of not only what is going on in the asylum system and the Home Office, but what is happening in housing, education, health. So it's the whole system. And putting those costs and those forecasts together, there's a lag to them in terms of the system and getting the information from local authorities and getting them back into the centre. So we don't, or I haven't seen, and I don't think we can expect to see, real-time up-to-date data on what's actually going on in terms of the actual costs of today. But the commitments that have been made by the Home Office would lead to an expectation those costs will start coming down.
Right, so rather than necessarily being sold at PUP, there was a sleight of hand that went on in the budget, which I'm yet to be disproved of.
Except, can I just say, the fact that our budget has just been increased to reflect both G&I and the reduction in Home Office costs, and I'll come back to you in terms of the proportion, would suggest that that is a practical example and demonstration that those costs have come down.
And Chair, if I could just add, there's also a ministerial board which has been re-established with the Chief Secretary of the Treasury and the Minister for deliberate look at ODA expenditure across the whole of government, including this aspect of it. I think the first meeting they're having, may already have, is going to look particularly at Indo and refugee costs. So I understand your question, but I think we absolutely are. And the Home Office also have an incentive because some of the asylum costs aren't odable. They have to bring down the overall budget. So I think there is an incentive on them as well, not just on us because it's our budget on the ODA side.
James?
Yeah, I was just going to ask, that you mentioned the 200 to 300 million uplift for spending. When did you hear about that if you're not getting ongoing insights into what money might come, and when will the next time be that you might hear an extra increase?
So we went through a process to make sure we could hit against the G&I forecast the full calendar year expenditure of 0.5 G&I spender and saver of last resort, and in discussing with the Treasury what that figure was, what we as a department needed to spend, and did we have through the rest of the financial year, which is what our control total is, enough money. That produced a figure which led to the Chief Secretary saying that he would give the uplift Nick described, which is subject to parliamentary approval through the supplementary estimates process. That was when we had that. Obviously, we've had it's in the budget. The Chancellor announced we've had a budget for 2025-26 as a financial year, and that's what no doubt go through. But then, as we look at the end of next year, the 25 calendar year target, obviously that will take account of actual outturn on in-country refugee costs, but also the size of G&I. So, sure, as the Treasury do their normal financial management through the course of the next financial year, they'll be keeping in touch with us around what the overall costs are, and what those mean for our budget, and what they're going to mean for what we're asked to spend in this calendar year to meet 0.5 in 2025.
Thank you.
Because we have to manage the two different things, a calendar year target.
James is still looking perplexed even as you keep giving.
Well, I'm not surprised because it's complicated because we're asked to manage the two different things. One is a G&I target in a calendar year, and the other is a financial year control total like any other government department. And they're overlapping in different time periods.
I think I share your view, Chair, that if I knew that there was potential revenue that could be coming to me and my department, I'd be wanting to monitor that very closely and make sure that it's on its way and I understand how much is coming. Sounds quite a trusting relationship that you're giving with the Home Office for them just to do their work, but you will ultimately benefit.
Could I just come back to this issue of dialogue? And you had said, oh, well, we've kind of handed that over to the Home Office. I mean, I threw a kind of bone at you, an idea, but I'm a former aid worker, so I kind of tend to look at things as an engineer and in those ways. But surely, actually, there could be some use in some ideas going the other way, especially from a development perspective, on how the Home Office might deal with some things.
I mean, we do have a director. In the end, as Nick said earlier, it's for the Home Secretary, advised by Home Office officials, to decide how to run the asylum system. And the Home Secretary has made a very clear commitment in bringing the asylum numbers down, and therefore the costs, including the impact on our budgets. I am very happy to take away your suggestions and discuss them with Matthew Rycroft.
Is the Foreign Secretary fighting this?
The Foreign Secretary is involved in the discussions with the Treasury and obviously with the Minister for Development on the overall cost and the impact on our budget, and also was fully aware of what we were doing at the end of last year to have the uplift to meet the 0.5.
Did you want to come in?
Very briefly, I'm just coming back to a point that you made, that your partners and deliverers, in-country deliverers, had digested the news that we were back down to 0.5% rather than 0.7%. My worry is, therefore, that there is no push to get back to what is a statutory target of 0.7%. Is that your feeling too, or are we stuck at 0.5%?
Well, the Treasury were clear in the autumn statement what the rules were on the return to 0.7, and the expectation that in the next budget period that those principles would not be met. So my expectation is we will stay at 0.5 over the course of the next spending round.
Thank you. Laura.
I'd like to turn to the FCDO workforce, briefly, conscious of time, but you spoke to the Foreign Affairs, Sir Philip, you spoke to the Foreign Affairs Committee about it, and you talked about the fact that men in the FCDO are more likely to receive a bonus payment than women, which I think you had put down to probably some unconscious bias in the system. I'd just like to pick up on that and ask you to expand on what the FCDO is doing to, if that's the case, to ensure that this bias does not limit the rewards and the opportunities for women.
Sure, and I'll ask Corin. Corin to add, because I think, if I remember right, since the FAC appearance, we've published our gender pay gap report, which does show progress, but more still to do. So there is still a gap, but it has fallen. It's also the case that the period that reflects, the bonuses in the delegated grades were actually at a flat cash arrangement for everybody because of the cost of living pressures on individuals, so that meant that there was no possibility of bias. So that is part of the reason why the figures improved. I think what we're doing is collecting data by area of business to understand what's going on, and therefore understand where there is something which is out of kilter, and then holding ourselves and leaders to account as the way of driving further progress. But Corin, do you want to add any more on the pay gap report?
Yes, just, I mean, we're making progress and continuing to bring the pay gap down. So, in fact, the median gender pay gap we brought down from 9.8% in 2020 down to 2.7% last year. So it's a big shift, and as Philip said, it's a mixture of whether it was the flat bonus, but also we're seeing increase in promotion of women into the SDS. So we're making progress on more women into the senior civil service, which makes a difference against gender pay gap. We're not yet at 50% for the senior civil service for women, but we're further than we were. We've gone from 41.6% in 2020 to 45.7%
Corin,
last year.
At nearly a 10% pay gap, sort of pre-merger, has that come down so dramatically because a lot of the senior people that left were men?
So I think it's a mixture of things that's helped bring that down. Partly it's around promotion, so the promotion of women into the SCS. Partly it's around alignment. We did more to align terms and conditions and shorten pay ranges last year, and those things help us to bring up people at the lower end of the scale, and there's still a greater proportion of women in the lower grades, and then also the flat bonus that Philip mentioned. So I don't think we could pinpoint specifically the point that you raised, Chair, about senior development specialists leaving necessarily.
Did you want to
Can I pick up on that point? So in your highest pay quartile, the gender distribution is about 10% apart between men and women. It's not unique to you, it happens across industry, and it's usually because women are leaving to have children and then obviously not coming back into the top echelons. What are you doing to encourage those women back?
So there's a mixture of things that we're doing, and it's that sort of first level of SDS in particular, where the senior civil service, where we're facing a real challenge, not just on gender, actually on other underrepresented groups. So we have an action plan which is targeted at gender and trying to identify the reasons that we're either losing women or not getting more women up into the senior civil service. We think there's a mixture of things, like in any organisation. We think there's a mixture of things going on. One is, as you say, sort of trying to encourage women and support women in coming back into the workforce after taking parental leave. Flexible working is another area that we're really focusing on, in particular for areas of work in the FCDO which traditionally have been less flexible working. For instance, work in the higher security areas of the more national security roles. We're doing quite a lot to push on flexible working by default, where people want it for those roles. So there's quite a drive on that.
Thank you. Let me pause you there and take it back to Laura.
Thank you. And to ask beyond gender, if we look at, in particular, race and disability and economic background, what measures are you taking to improve diversity in those areas?
So we have, again, action plans for race and for disability, LGBO as well, LGBT plus colleagues. On socioeconomic diversity, we're just starting to get a grip of, as is, I think, the whole of the civil service, the data picture and what that looks like, and we're starting to develop interventions around that. So our next step will be an action plan on socioeconomic diversity. On race, so we do have an action plan. We've got a target for 2026 to reach aspiration of 14%, which is sort of the national average across the grades. We've met that at our director level in the organisation, but we haven't met it at the level directly beneath that. We have met it for some of the lower grades, so that we're trying to target interventions around the specific grades where we're struggling to do that. So we've got a race action plan, and an area where we're particularly trying to focus is on our black staff as well. We've set up a black employee association because that area in particular on race is one where we're struggling. So we're also doing a race culture inquiry this year to try and get to the bottom of some of the challenges that we're facing.
Disability?
On disability, again, it is at the senior civil service level where we're struggling across all grades. We're just about there in terms of aspiration. If you look at the whole of the workforce, we're more or less at the sort of 13% representation, but we're really struggling on STS in particular.
Why do you think that is?
Trying to understand what's going on. I think there's a range of issues, one of which is around accessibility in the estate, which we've got a programme of work, both in terms of our UK buildings, but also as we're taking on a new building overseas, making sure that from the get-go that building is properly accessible. We're also looking at what we can do to support staff working again in the high classification area on higher security, so around sort of helping staff that are visually impaired or need hearing support, but we need specific technology in a high classification area. So there's a number of things that we're doing to try and support people with individual needs.
On your exit interviews, which I assume you do you ask people if there are reasons why they haven't stayed within the service? I'm just thinking if people are coming in at the lower levels but then they're not making it to the higher levels, you've obviously got an institutional block somewhere there, whether that's a physical one or whether that's a psychological one. Are you picking away at that as well?
We are. We do exit interviews. I think probably I would say that not everybody is doing them, and so we're trying to have a push on ensuring we do them and then collect the data. I think it's not as good as it could be. But one of the things we're doing is we've got a very active network. Our staff networks generally are very active, so they're very vocal in gathering views and feeding into my teams in the corporate area about the things that we can do. We've also got a board champion for disability, one of my colleagues. So again, he meets with myself and my team and with the network regularly, and we try and work through the action plan to see what more we can do. But I mean, there's a lot more to do.
A reality? Are people coming in and then people with disabilities coming in and then not making it up to the higher level, or is it just an anomaly, do you think?
I'd need to check in terms of data. I think the
it's just interesting that you're doing well at that senior level in terms of racial diversity, but in terms of gender and disability, it's the other way round. The challenge, and you're doing much better at the junior levels. That's a fair characterisation. But if it is, why do you think that is?
So sorry, I don't think that's the case on. Did you say?
When you look at race, you're doing quite well at director level, less well at lower levels, which seems to be the reverse.
So sorry, that was probably me not being.
But that would just be like a person.
Very clear. It just depends. So at director level, we're doing well, but then you go the level above that, and actually the numbers come down again. So I think it changes as the pipeline changes.
Basically, when are we getting this report? Because there was a gender pay gap report. When are we going to get to see a copy of it? So rather than asking you questions, can we just read it?
Yes, so we've published that in November, so we can ensure that.
Then I apologise for being a numpty and not reading in advance of this. And are you doing ones for the other areas of equality?
So gender is the only one where there's the requirement across civil service to do a pay gap report, but ethnicity is coming, and so I think we're expecting that requirement to happen across government from this year, and we will be undertaking that as well.
Thank you, James.
I just wanted to move specifically onto the 2023-24 annual accounts. In there's a £1.1 million fraud case in Southeast Asia relating to procurement. I just wondered if you could explain what that fraud related to.
So I'm going to be slightly cautious because some of it's still possibly subject of criminal investigations, but it's something we uncovered and immediately wanted to put in the accounts to be transparent about. And it is, as you rightly say, it's about 1 million. What we did was look immediately as what our best understanding was through our internal audit team of what had happened, so that we could take action against those responsible, and has been disciplinary action, including in dismissal. And as I say, there may be potential for criminal action later as well. I won't go into in detail on exactly what happened. But second, we also looked at what is this telling us potentially about vulnerabilities elsewhere, and kind of quickly then looked at any lessons we needed to learn in terms of our processes. It was basically a fraud around use of corporate credit cards. And so the thing we want to understand quickly is whether this was a one-off enabled through individuals doing things, wrongdoing as it were, or whether actually there was a process problem we needed to close.
And how's the investigation progressing at this point?
So it has included disciplinary action, including dismissal. So I think we now have a complete understanding of what happened and have acted against the individuals responsible. It's just there is still an additional possibility of criminal action as well.
When will we know more on that?
I would have to come back to that, I'm afraid, James. I don't know off the top of my head.
Okay. Good. Are we expecting to recover those funds? Do you know?
Possibly some, but it's normally pretty hard to recover in some overseas jurisdictions. But yes, it's not impossible.
Okay.
We will absolutely endeavour to recover as much as we can.
Okay. And does that come from the age budget then? Does that mean there's less being spent
that
on
will
other
that will
programs?
not be ODA.
It definitely won't.
Yeah. That's right.
That's right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
And I think there was a similar amount in terms of fraud in the 2022-23 annual accounts related to Sierra Leone. Yes.
Yeah, and I wrote to. I'm happy to share the letter, but I wrote to.
Yes, I think we've seen that.
PAC.
We've seen that letter, and so. Is there a concern that there's a pattern of this happening in overseas jurisdictions? What steps are being taken to try and prevent such instances?
So that's actually the right question. So on Sierra Leone again, it was about fuel and fraudulent disposal of fuel, as it were, and oversupply, and that was the fraud. So we looked immediately across the whole of our network. Where are there similar fuel arrangements? Where do we? What were the lessons out of this? What do we need to make sure was happening? And then we looked at what the longer term lessons were. It's actually about, and again we looked at disciplinary action about how you make sure that your leadership locally is actually applying the controls and making sure they're in place in the right way. I mean, the truth is, in our global network, 280 posts around the world in 170 countries, we operate in environments where fraud is more across the board is more prevalent than others. We will always want to do our best to make sure we minimise the risk of fraud, but that will never be zero. We are investing more in our overall effort on fraud, both in terms of awareness, training for kind of senior leaders and managers, including kind of heads of mission and their deputies, but also we have a network of fraud liaison officers. I think now over 100, isn't it, Corin? We've established to increase, if you like, the systemic approach across the whole of our overseas operations to counter fraud.
And you're satisfied that we're making progress overall?
Making progress, but we've got an action plan. There's more to do, isn't there?
There's more to do. We need to kind of keep going because there is that constant risk. I think overall we know we sort of meet the I think it's 3-to-1 return on investment in terms of the fraud prevented or recovered versus what we're investing in our anti-fraud effort. But we need to keep going. I think as Philip said, we've got mandatory training on fraud prevention for all staff in the organisation, which they have to do, and their sort of IT system makes them do it. We've got constant reminders and we've got ways of monitoring compliance on that, and that is helping in terms of building capability and awareness, as well as the fraud liaison officers as well, that we're building that capability across the network. But we need to keep going.
Thank you.
Just found it. Would you mind sharing the latest compliance data with us?
Yep.
Thank you.
David Mundell.
Thank you. The last time you were here, Sir Philip, I found you a little bit evasive around the issue of Abercrombie House, which we were discussing, and then it turned out within about 24 hours the FCDO made an announcement that they were leaving Abercrombie House to go to other premises in Glasgow. So I wonder, given that there now seems to have those plans don't seem to have unfolded as they were originally announced, if you could give us an update on exactly where we are in relation to both specifically Abercrombie House, but also the FCDO's intention to remain significally based within Scotland.
So I can understand why you thought I was being evasive. We were near the end of finalising the announcement, which we wanted staff to hear first. And if I remember right, I hadn't quite got there when I appeared in front of you. So I apologise if I sounded evasive. It wasn't intentional.
It was very professional.
We did our best. We did our best to inform the chair.
You're forgiven.
Once we were ready to do so. On where we are, I'll be honest with you. The plan remains the plan, including the very significant uplift number of people from just under 1,000 to 1,500, but it's taken a bit longer than I would have liked to identify the building in central Glasgow to move to. We're nearly there. It's with the business case has gone through our processes and gone through our ministers. It's with the Treasury, so it is imminent. I can't look you in the eye and give you an exact date because it's with the Treasury, as it were. In the meantime, and Nick should add, because he's been leading a lot of this work, we've been going through the organisation to work out what are the roles that we would now do out of Scotland as we significantly increase our presence, and thinking about how to, as an organisation, make a success of that. Because what we want to be able to do is offer a whole career out of Glasgow. Not just a silo of this or a silo of that. So we've done some cross-organisation work to what that would look like as we actually then begin to move into the building once it's ready. But Nick, do you want to add on that?
No, I think that's a good description. And this is all part of our securing our long-term commitment to Scotland.
And within that, just go back to what you were saying, Phil, because I think one of the issues that emerged previously was that the pattern of grades of the work available, it wasn't a balanced one, so that therefore it wasn't possible to progress. And if you wanted to progress, you would have to leave Scotland effectively.
So if we want somebody to have a full spectrum possibility of career in Scotland, we need to do two things. One is get more senior jobs up there. So at the moment we've got 20 senior civil servants up there. We want to move an additional 50, so we're going to get that up to 70, which is quite a significant uplift. But also we can't do highly secure work in Scotland at the moment because we don't have the high side capabilities. We've got to build that as well.
So when the committee went and visited, I can't remember how many years ago, we were told that facility was being installed. So 2, 3, 4 years on, why hasn't that happened? Isn't Scotland worth it?
Well, it's certainly worth doing it. In Abercrombie House, if we were to do it, we would have to basically re-engineer all the power supply, put a
so in the new building, will that be in there from day one?
The new building, we're starting from a blank sheet of paper, and it's going to be a lot easier to build a bigger capability in the new building.
But that wasn't the question. The question was, will the secure room facility be there in the new building?
Yes.
Great.
And well, as the chair's indicated, I mean, we're hoping to visit Abercrombie House and the staff in Glasgow. What are they going to tell us? Are they going to give us a positive? Are they going to give us a positive message in relation to how this process has developed and been managed?
I don't want to speak for them because they should speak for themselves. But I went up and it was on the screen and announced we were moving to Glasgow. I think it's fair to say it was a mixed reception, including in the moment. I understand that. You know, if you live in East Kilbride, close to the current building, that's obviously very convenient. Although if you look at actually where our people live overall, a lot of them are spread around, and central Glasgow is just, or in some cases more convenient. It's also a much better place to recruit from. If you look at where you can, we're looking at what sort of expertise we could very helpfully, like for example, cybersecurity recruit in that in that area. I think people basically now know we're moving. I think my instinct is that on average more people are in favour of the move than against. I'm not saying everyone is supportive. I think there's a degree of frustration which is totally understandable. It's taken a bit longer than we would have hoped to actually say this is the building and this is when it will happen. So I think that is what you'll hear. I was there before Christmas and talked to everyone there, and that was my sense of where they are and what you'll hear. But they should speak for themselves.
Yeah. So you have got a building.
We have got a building in mind, yes. And as I say,
the
business case. Well, we have got a building. Basically, the business case.
Have you got a lease on a building?
No, sorry.
Have you got a lease on a building?
We've got a building in mind. We need the Treasury to sign off. We need the Treasury to sign off the business case, and we need to complete our commercial negotiations.
So you haven't actually got a building yet.
But we are in the end game of Treasury to sign off and
so
signing on a dotted line.
You haven't got a signed lease.
Not quite yet.
Okay. So this could be. So if you're going to have to do building work as well, this could be years still. So
it will take some time to do the building, to finish the building.
So these people have been in limbo already for 18 months, is it?
Well, they've carried on working where they were already working, is the way I've described it.
Yeah, but they don't know if they're going to have to move, relocate, change their children's schools. I mean, this is a lot you're asking already. Very, very committed, hard-working staff.
So we have a director up there who leads our overall approach to this, and works out of Abercrombie House, Colin Martin Reynolds, and engages intensively with colleagues working there, and keeps them absolutely informed with the state of progress of the AWEL programme, including identifying a building and likely timescales.
It's amazing that two departments can be merged in a matter of weeks, yet from moving from one building to another, we're 18 months, is it, since the announcement's made? And we still haven't got a building. Thank you. David, you get our last questions.
Just on transparency, got a great record on it. What can other foreign ministries learn from us? Transparency, sorry.
Well, we are pleased that we got back our global rating very good in 2024, and that was a function of getting our dev tracker back up and running. We do monthly, we publish monthly all our ODA spend to IRT standards, and we also have got business cases published, but also country plans published as well. So that was how we got back to very good. And I suppose my learning for other departments would be twofold. One is you've got to get the systems in place to do it. And the reason why it's took us so long to get back our standard was because of our reintroduction of the new finance and HR system. The other is that, as with other countries, we aren't the only aid spender. So there are other departments who spend aid money in the UK. And what we're going to do this year is we are going to do a UK aid transparency review of other government departments. And we're going to launch that this month, which will take until about the summer. We're going to do a review of their compliance of publishing ODA spend to IARTI standards and doing a qualitative review and identifying recommendations for improvement. And I think that's the key, because you can't only just do it in your aid agency, you've got to do it across the whole of the government.
And I would observe that pre-merger, the old FCO was only at FAIR, so actually it's a merger benefit. The old FCO's expenditure is now up at where old DFID was very good. So we had a bit of a dip because of the drag of the FCO approach, and we now, across a wider range of government expenditure on ODA, are very good on transparency.
Thank you. You're done. Thank you ever so much. We really appreciate the amount of time that you've given to us, and we really appreciate the work that all of your team do. I'm very, very proud, as I know the committee members are, of the FCDO team. You have such tenacity when faced with the biggest problems around the world, and you just get on and do the job, and you're a great representation of us all, so thank you, and please pass it on to the staff. Thank you very much. Thank you. Order. I'd like to just very briefly pause while the Minister comes in. If I could ask you to swap over and we can swap. Hello and welcome. Committee members, if we can start the session. Minister, I do apologise. We started late because, like you, we were in the chamber for the urgent questions. So thank you very much for making the time for us today. Committee members have all got questions that they want to ask you. And you've been in your post now for 6-7 months? Yes, and we've seen you all over the world and in the chambers, so hopefully you've got a good idea of what your role is, what your priorities are, so we're very interested to pick away at those with you, if that's okay. And to start that process off, could I hand to David Mundell?
Thank you and welcome, Minister. Can I ask you, what are your overall priorities for the UK's development programme during your term of office?
Brilliant. Well, I'll be delighted to set them out in just one moment. If you'll permit me, Chair, I just want to say, first of all, what a huge privilege it is for me to be in front of you. I really mean that. Doing this job is, I have to say, a dream come true, actually, for me. It really has been such a privilege. So very excited to be having this session with all of you. And I also want to thank the committee, because you've been very generous to me at various points when I've asked for your advice and input, particularly before I went to the West Bank, so thank you all. In terms of my priorities, it's very clear to me that the UK has to have a modern development policy. We have to restore our reputation on international development, and obviously my party in our manifesto committed ourselves to working towards a world free from poverty on a livable planet. Well, how do we do that when we know that the world is currently a very complex one, contested one, where we have, as you all know in depth, and you're all experts on this, more countries in conflict than at any time since the 1940s, when we've got the climate crisis really hammering millions of people around the world, and also where we have humanitarian principles under so much pressure. So I started from a position of saying, first of all, we need to ensure that the UK's development policy is run through modern partnerships with the Global South, partnerships that are genuine, that are respectful, and also we must use the expertise that we have within the UK. And it is enormous expertise when it comes to development. It is huge. We also have that expertise when it comes to research, technology, science, and of course we have the City of London as well when it comes to catalysing the finance that's necessary. So I set that out in a Chatham House speech in October, that framework. Since then, we've been working on refining our priorities that come out of that framework. So to set them out really quickly, and hopefully you will have seen them reflected in some of the decisions we've taken, and we might move on to that later. Our priorities have been making sure that the UK is working with our partners to promote jobs and growth in those global south countries. That's what time and again they say they really need to be working with us on. That we're unlocking access to finance, to investment. That requires, of course, deep and wide reform of the global financial systems. That's been another priority for us. Thirdly, that we're working to lift people out of crisis situations. I know we'll go on to talk about a number of them, but also that we're ensuring people have the resilience that they need so that they're not falling into crisis, so they're not having to move out of their home region, being pushed by crisis to do that. Fourthly, that we are preventing and reducing the drivers of conflict. And finally, that we're supporting education and health systems, and particularly domestic health and education systems in different countries. Now, while we're delivering those priorities, of course, women and girls and climate have got to be at the heart of all we do. But to me, that is fundamental in any case to a modern development policy. So thank you very much for that question.
And in the context of funding, there's always been an ongoing debate between bilateral and multilateral funding. Have you a view as to where the right balance applies there? Because we're heading up, for example, to two very important replenishments, the Global Fund, which I've obviously raised with you in the Chamber, and Gavi as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's such an important question, and it's one that I've been thinking about really deeply, because I think we need to both take the right decisions for the medium term, but also for the long term as well. And that does mean making sure that we get that balance right. I think, for example, it's very important that we're ensuring, when it comes to multilateral funding, that we're also reflecting our partners' concerns within that. So when we have decided to boost our support for multilateral mechanisms, I mean, a good example of that, I think, would be IDA, where we said that we would be increasing our contribution by 40%, of course, the World Bank's fund for the poorest countries. We made sure that in doing that, we were articulating very clearly to the World Bank that we expected them to be doing much better at supporting fragile and conflict-affected states, for example, empowering women economically as well. And I'm pleased to say that we did get a long way along that path with the World Bank. But then at the same time, we need to make sure that we have those bilateral programmes which are really targeted at our priorities as the UK and delivering overall for that goal of poverty reduction. I have to say I've seen that working really effectively in many different countries, but I do think we need to do more. We've got to be bringing this together more. You'll know, of course, we've got that review of development capability and capacity that's been running with Minouche Shafiq. Now, one of the issues that she's been looking at is how we can get that coordination working really effectively. So when we're supporting multilateral mechanisms, like those in health, for example, which I know you've been a great champion of, that is integrated with the work that we're then doing bilaterally. And I would just add into it as well, regionally, too, because increasingly we're going to see that there are regional mechanisms engaged on many of these questions. We need to make sure all that's joined up.
Minister, you've given us a vast amount of information in a very small amount of time, and I think colleagues want to pick away at some of that. The first thing I want to pick away at, the IDA uplift of 40%. I was surprised that you did that. I didn't know that that was something that they were lobbying for or was your intention. What's being cut as a consequence of that?
So you probably heard in the previous session that I know that you had with officials that because of the decisions that have been taken by the Chief Secretary of the Treasury, of course in discussion with us, that at year end Darren was able to say, of course subject to the agreement of Parliament, as with any such financial measure, that the FCDO will receive an ODA uplift in the region of 400 million for capital, financial transactions, and 140 million resource budget for 2024 to 25. Now, of course, some of that is because of the late increases to GNI, which, as you all know in spades, of course, we've got to account for in terms of our percentage commitment. But it was also because of reductions in other government spend, including on in-donor refugee costs. So that has meant that actually we're not in a situation of having to cut measures. But I do think it's really important, Chair, that you've raised this, because I have very much sought to learn from what's taken place in previous years. We have had a situation where there's been a lot of turbulence around aid spend. I would want to say on this, I'm really grateful to my predecessor, now in opposition, who was briefly serving, of course, as the Shadow Foreign Secretary, Andrew Mitchell. He's been really generous with his time. I've had a lot of good discussions with him, and he had to deal with a situation where there had been very unpredictable increases in donor refugee costs in particular. That had led to programmes being cut, some of them right in the middle. Yeah, now, I do not want us to ever end up in that situation again. That means that we're determined to have a longer-term approach where we're really clear about what we are certain that we will be able to fund into the future. That is fundamental to the kind of partnership that I was just talking about a moment ago. And we are determined to deliver that so that we no longer have that kind of unpredictable situation. We are taking decisions about what we will prioritise and what we won't prioritise, of course. And you would expect us to do that as part of the kind of budget management that's necessary, but also to target our effort in a world where that need is so great.
So if the 40% is from this additional money rather than cutting the existing budget, should we take that as an indication that you're moving to multilateral funding and taking away from the project funding, because it was the project funding that got the most savage cuts and caused the most decimation when their money was taken away? So is that how you're looking to prevent that very disruptive impact of funding changes?
So no, Chair, we're seeking to ensure that where possible we are seeing continuity within the bilateral programme. Now, the reason for that is because of what I talked about before, that I think there was a lot of damage that was created to relationships. We saw staff in some cases, having contracts terminated, that kind of thing, but also a direct impact on provision. Now, I'm determined we don't end up in that situation again. That is meant, for example, when it comes to the bilateral allocations for 2024 to 25, and they will be published, of course, in due course. I know that the committee will be interested around that I've sought to ensure, of course, that we're responsive to new concerns, but that we're not making big significant changes, because I don't want to see that kind of disruption. Of course, we're now looking forward to the longer term spending review, where all of these decisions are being viewed in the round, so that we can get the balance right for the reasons that were set out a moment ago.
David,
sorry, I just have one small.
Oh, I'm coming back to you.
So
is it on the first? Is it on the
yes,
first
it is
chunk?
on. It's on number one.
I didn't, in my initial question, specifically reference the Nutrition for Growth conference, because I understand that you're going to come back to us when we, as part of our SDG2 inquiry. But I did, in relation to your own priorities, just want to ask you whether you intended to attend the conference in person.
So I would love to attend the conference in person. I don't think we've sorted out our exact arrangements around it, but certainly we're preparing for that Paris conference right now. I've had preliminary discussions around it and the kind of work that we will need to undertake with partners. Of course, you and other committee members, I'm sure, will be aware that we worked hard with the Brazilian G20 leadership around their global alliance against hunger and poverty, and some of the work from that is going to be really important, I think, for that Nutrition for Growth Summit. So I know that's of great interest to yourself, but I just wanted to mention that for other members' interest as well.
So on your first introductory answer, I've got David Taylor, then David Reed, then Alice.
Hi, Minister. Just a very quick question to follow up on the Shafiq review. Just wondered if there was expected publication date for that, and if there was a sneak preview, any more further details you could give about where it's headed.
Great. Well, thanks so much for that question. Of course, Manoush Shafiq has been focused on issues that I know have been of considerable concern to the committee around capability and capacity, really making sure that we are doing all that we can to restore our development reputation, as I mentioned before. She's been working at pace on that. Now, her report is going to be obviously to myself and to the Foreign Secretary as well. So it is to us rather than predominantly something that would be, a kind of book that might be, published by a publisher or something like this. But of course, we will seek to ensure that the committee is informed about the findings of that. And I know that, particularly given that issue of how we really can be putting our best foot forward, ensuring that there's value for money, but also that we're catalysing that UK expertise on those issues. I know you'll want to know what we're drawing out of that review, so I will definitely make sure that you're kept informed of that. Yeah.
I'm going to push you further on David's point. So timescales of when you're anticipating it, and also is there the possibility for this committee to have a private session around terms of reference?
On the latter, I think that would be a really good idea, actually. I think, personally, I don't have any problem with that at all. I'm just looking at officials, but I think that would be sensible. At the time when we commissioned the review, some of those principles were set out, but, it would be good to talk about that together, of course, given the committee's expertise in this area. I think that would be really sensible. And then when it comes to timings, so we are working on this right now. I don't want to kind of lay any hostages to fortune, but clearly we want to be moving ahead speedily on this as a new government. We think it's really important that we are making progress as quickly as possible.
So when I gave evidence, the Commissioner was looking at sort of doing the report over the Christmas break and getting it to you sort of now. So is that still the timescale?
Well, I've been having discussions with Baroness Shafiq throughout the whole process. Obviously I've seen a considerable amount of material from her already, and certainly I would hope that we would be able to both have that private discussion that was mentioned before, but also to be sharing how we're going to take this forward with the committee as soon as possible.
Great. So that sounds like you've got the report already.
Well, look, I'm not going to kind of spike anything. I certainly understand her thinking. I understand what she's focused on. I know who she's been speaking with. I'm very grateful indeed to those committee members who've given up their time, to the many experts who've spoken with her. It really has been a valuable exercise. And I think now we need to really be focused on how we can drive that change forward that is necessary.
Thank you. Yeah. David Reid.
Thank you, Chair. And Minister. I'll ask similar questions to the ones that I asked the FCDO officials. I think because development has become quite contentious now in the UK, what I find is the issue is that we dive straight into the priorities without outlining what the high-level view of why we're doing this in the first place. And it's very difficult then to communicate that to the UK public on why their taxpayers' money is being spent on this. So what do you think development is for the UK? And crucially, why should the UK public care and why should they be spending their money on it?
Yeah, I think that's such a good question, and it's something that I'm really passionate about as well. I think that when people realise that back in 1980, about 50% of the world lived in extreme poverty, now about 1 in 10 people in the world live in extreme poverty, they can see that we can make progress together. When the UK works in partnership with other countries on development, but in other areas as well, on trade, on other aspects of economic development, on conflict prevention, of course, as well, on facing up to the climate crisis, when we work together, we really can deliver change. And the British public know that. And when you look at polling that has been conducted, you can see quite clearly that the British public support the UK working with other countries on these challenges. They do want us to be working on partnership. They believe that's important. I agree with them. They want us to be focused on jobs and growth. And they also know that when there's greater global growth, that benefits our country too. So that would be my answer. I think there are certain things that, as part of that answer, we shouldn't be doing. that I feel really strongly about. I think very often, sometimes there's been a pattern of talking about a raw figure of money that is going to a particular place without explaining why the UK is engaged, exactly what we're doing and how it's going to make a difference. So I think we've got to be crystal clear on that. But I believe when we do that, the UK public are very supportive of this, and time again, they have supported that activity.
I will push back very slightly on that, and I'm sure, as I said before, many MPs here will have those same conversations with their constituents, that I think that narrative is changing very rapidly. And when you look at things that are happening in the UK, cost of living crisis, where people are worried about their own money, they are concerned about their money being sent overseas, and I think there needs to be a radical shift to explaining why we're spending money on international development. I'm still not hearing that cohesive narrative for why we're doing all these different priorities and how it benefits the UK public.
Well, I agree with you that we've... Sorry, Chair, if you're happy with me. Responding to that, I certainly agree that there has to be clarity. I think that's very important.
I think that's what I'm looking for at the moment, Minister.
Right, okay. Well, as I said, I think the most important thing is to show that we can make that change, that we have made it before and that we're making it right now. If we just set out, as I said before, for example, figures of money, I really don't think that helps. But as a corollary to this, we've got to be absolutely focused on ensuring that taxpayers' money is being spent where it's needed, when it's needed, and in a way that will genuinely achieve our outcomes. Now, I've been focused on that, as you would expect as a minister. I'm absolutely determined to ensure that we have value for money. I know that's something that's of great concern to the committee as well. In fact, you've been just working on this. I've just made sure that we supplied a response to you on that issue. But that is really important for me as well, because I think quite often people's concerns may be around whether their hard-earned taxpayers' money is going to be used in a way that's really going to make a difference. And they're right to be concerned about that. And that's why that value for money guarantee is so important.
Thank you. Alice?
Yeah, just to go back to the question on multilateral and bilateral spending and your priorities. Obviously, we make our decisions as a country, but we are going to see obviously change of administration in the US, and they are the largest donor by volume. Admittedly, I think less of their aid goes to multilateral aid, but previously President-elect Trump had proposed pulling out of the WHO. There were 20% cuts proposed under the last administration. Are you concerned about the impact that that may have on where we're putting our money and the effectiveness, particularly of multilateral aid? And have you had conversations already with counterparts at USAID in terms of how that might impact on the effectiveness of our programmes?
Yes, so I have had a number of discussions with counterparts at USAID on a number of issues, and I'm very grateful to them for their time. Of course, the UK has worked with a whole variety of different US administrations of every political stripe. We've always done that, to work together, and that will continue. But at the same time, I would say, we as the UK must have that clear set of priorities for ourselves on international development. As I said before, working in partnership, genuine partnership with the Global South. And it means having the kind of priorities, indeed, that I just set out a few moments ago. I think I'm being very clear about what it is we believe our country can be delivering, how we can use our expertise. I think when it comes to the current US administration and then the subsequent one as well, I think we've seen, for example, that under the previous Trump administration, there was a focus on jobs and growth. Well, we share that focus on jobs and growth. There also has been coming from the incoming US administration a focus on saying that they want to engage in conflict prevention, on ending war. Well, so do we. So we will ensure that we work together with other nations, whether that's the US or many other countries that we'll be seeking to work in partnership with, so that we can deliver that manifesto commitment of building a world free from poverty on a livable planet.
Thank you. Back to David.
Yes. The final question I wanted to ask you was, you have two roles, because you're also the Minister for Women and Equalities. How do you balance those roles, and are they complementary, or are they, or does it challenge your time allocation?
I mean, I've had, the reason why I'm smiling is I've had so many amazing experiences since I came into my role. And one of the most moving was when I was in Indonesia with a gathering of female politicians from all over Indonesia, all kinds of different backgrounds. And one of them said, "Oh, I'm really pleased that the UK has a Minister for Development and for Women and Equalities. We should have one too." And I said, "Oh, that's great. That's really brilliant."
And is that how you see them, as interconnected rather than two separate roles?
Most definitely, because as I mentioned at the beginning, I think in order to have a modern development policy that is effective, women and girls must be at the heart of that development policy. Otherwise, there's no way to create, economic growth. There's no way to have an effective healthcare system. There's no way to face up to the climate crisis either if we don't include women and girls. And of course, that applies when it comes to other areas of equality too. So I think the two actually marry very well together. I also think it's very important when we talk about partnership that we're clear that that partnership is an equal partnership. The reason why I mention that is because clearly we want to ensure, for example, when it comes to women and girls, that there is continuing support for sexual and reproductive health and rights, for women's healthcare. Now, I can say genuinely when I have those discussions with partners, we haven't got this all right in the UK. We're working hard because we've got to improve women's health provision in the UK, for example, because we have to make sure that we're halving violence against women and girls in the UK. And we're working really hard on that, and we've got to do more on it. So I can be clear that we as the UK need to make changes there. And I think that's very important, actually, if we're going to have that kind of a genuine conversation, one that isn't lecturing, one that isn't one-sided, one that is genuinely listening and working together in partnership.
But I mean, there are big challenges because certain countries are moving backwards in relation to LGBT plus rights, and the issue of providing help and support, yet at the same time not supporting the policies and environment that the government on the ground is creating, and that is a big challenge.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it's absolutely critically important in those circumstances to speak very openly and honestly. And as I said, that does mean acknowledging where in our own country we need to make changes. That's also been the case, for example, with racial equality, and indeed on LGBT plus equality too, where we're seeking to make changes as well. So I think without that kind of, frankly, you could call it authenticity or openness, transparency, it's impossible to have those kinds of conversations. But when you start from saying, we're all on a journey on this, I think you can get far further.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, Minister, don't you feel that of two issues of such critical importance, they should have their own ministers?
Well, we've got more than just me, of course, because we also have Bridget Phillipson, we've got Seema Malhotra working on racial equality, Nia Griffiths on LGBT plus people as well. We've got a number of different ministers who are focused on these issues, and rightly so, on equalities matters. So indeed they're embedded within our missions for government. So that really is ensuring that we're determined to deliver for equality, but also, as I said, for development. And I genuinely do believe that if we don't consider the role and potential of women and girls from the beginning of development policy, it will simply not be as effective as it needs to be. So I certainly make no apologies for saying it's right that they're brought together. Yeah.
But Minister, I would argue, so all the examples that you gave just then, great, but all of those women have got very busy portfolios as well. So is it any more than a tick box exercise that they have those briefings? How can they possibly give the attention and dedication that is needed for disabilities, for example? And I hear what you're saying about overseas, but also women and girls in this country need a very powerful advocate, and I would say a full-time one, if not a couple of full-timers working on just this, because we're seeing across the world rights are being rolled back at rapid speed. So is that something that you're trying to advocate for in this government, rather than just seeing them as a nice to have on someone else's portfolio?
Well, it certainly isn't the latter, that's for sure. And I would say genuinely to members of this committee, judge us on what we deliver. And you will see that we have been delivering on all of those areas.
Deliver double if you've got two people.
Well, actually, for me, what's important is whether we're actually getting on with the job and making those changes. You know, I felt it was critically important when I was attending the cross-government committee that was set up on our mission to halve violence against women and girls, that I could talk about the UK expertise through the What Works programme around reducing violence against women and girls in a number of African nations, that I could talk about that and the fact that we need to learn from that when we're developing our mission within the UK. And equally, I could apply the learnings from what we're doing here to our programme around countering violence against women and girls internationally as well. So I genuinely do believe that we're making progress on this. I hope the committee will hold me to account on this, and indeed that the Women and Equality Select Committee will hold me to account on women and equalities issues as well.
Thank you. Yeah. Monica.
Turning to money, were you satisfied, Minister, with the ODA settlement in the autumn budget?
Of course, every single government minister will always say that in an ideal world there would be limitless resources. The reality is, unfortunately, that we've had a situation where, I mean, I don't need to rehearse this because you all know it, we've had that £22 billion black hole. We're working really hard to get our country onto a more fiscally sustainable trajectory for the future. And that has meant, obviously, the decisions that have been taken by the Chancellor. I, however, am encouraged by the fact that, as I mentioned before, the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, of course, subject to parliamentary approval, the MPs in this room and all the other ones, that there will be that uplift in ODA for 2024 to 25, that we're ensuring that we have a much more stable approach in financing for the future. I think that's really important. And of course we have a manifesto commitment to reach 0.7% being spent on overseas development assistance as fiscal circumstances allow. So of course that is what we're aiming towards. But for me, the absolutely fundamental thing in the short to medium term and then into the long term is having that greater stability and predictability. And that's what our partners have said to us time and again they need.
So part of the £22 million black hole was actually ODA spend on in-country refugee costs. I think the figure was 2.6 billion. Can I also, I'm interested in how the 0.5% of GNI was arrived at. Yourself and the Chancellor and the Prime Minister actually vigorously resisted the two fiscal tests in Parliament when they were proposed by the last Conservative government. The Chancellor argued that the simplicity of the 0.7% commitment is that it reflects difficult domestic conditions. And in fact, the Prime Minister called it slippery and thought it would lead to an indefinite ODA cut. Now, we've just spoken to your two officials who tell me they don't expect to get into the position of 0.7% because the OBR say they can't under the fiscal rules that your party so vigorously argued against. So why choose those fiscal rules? And how did you arrive at the 0.5% GNI?
Well, of course, the 0.5% was the decision of the previous government. That was already the inheritance that we received. But if you're asking me, would I wish that we were in different fiscal circumstances? Of course I wish that. This is not the only area where an incoming government would obviously want to see the finances being in a better state. I mean, clearly that is the case, but that is why we have been taking that action to get our finances on a much stronger footing for the future. And, you know, I'm sure you would, just about every select committee, I suspect, will be having a similar discussion. But I would say perhaps the difference to previously, maybe, is that this government is really determined to get our economy into a situation where it is more sustainable into the future. That will mean taking some difficult decisions that some parties may agree with or not. But we're doing that so we can be in that stronger position in the future.
It's not a question on the circumstances, it's a question on the fiscal conditions that the government have chosen to use to set the 0.5% and not yet get to the 0.7%. So my question is, how did you arrive at that 0.56% that we're at the moment, and where is the ambition to get to the 0.7%?
Well, the ambition is within our manifesto. It's a manifesto commitment that we reach it as fiscal circumstances allow. Those fiscal rules were set out, of course, by the Chancellor. She set them out as the means to ensure that we would be genuinely growing our economy, but above all, ensuring that our fiscal circumstances are more stable into the future.
Minister, can I pause you there? Because I think we're getting some confusion over two sets of fiscal rules. So I think you're talking about the fiscal rules for the economy. I think Monica is talking about the fiscal rules that were set for when the last government, felt able to go back to 0.7. And if I could quote to you, these are not this was the then shadow Chancellor, the now Chancellor, in July 2021 on the debate when the government and Parliament voted to cut GNI and put the fiscal measures in place. She said, these are not tests to go back to 0.7 of GNI spent on overseas aid. They are tests to stop that ever happening under a Conservative government again. So I find it quite curious that after saying that, the Shadow Chancellor has now adopted the same fiscal rules the last Conservative government put in place, and you're telling us that the government is committed to go back to 0.7, even though she said under the rules that you've taken on, that's not possible. So I think that's, Monica, am I correct?
Right.
I think there is confusion here, if I may say so. I mean, of course, it's within the International Development Act in 2015 that the overall framework is set.
Correct.
But within that act, the precise fiscal rules are not fully set out.
And the Conservative government in 2021 brought forward
who then,
two tests,
that's
which
correct.
I think are the fiscal rules we're talking about.
Yes, which were their tests.
The now Chancellor
which were their
said
tests.
it's impossible.
And we've been clear that the fiscal rules are only one expression of government's policy. We're working really hard to create the conditions so that we can grow our economy, so that we can deliver across a whole number of different areas.
You don't have to adopt the last government's fiscal rules around, the tests to get back to 0.7. So why don't you just change them? You're in government now. You don't have to follow them.
Well, we have changed a number of rules in different areas, but we will always do that.
About this area.
But we'll always do that in a way that is fiscally sensible. We never want our country to be back in the kind of position that we were in previously.
Would want that. We understand that. What I think Monica is trying to get at is why have you adopted the rules the Conservative government put in place, which our now Chancellor said meant we would never get back to 0.7.
And which are rules that you vigorously opposed, as did the Prime Minister, as did the Chancellor?
Well, look, we really are determined to ensure that we can get to 0.7%. That is a manifesto commitment.
But it's hard to
there
see
are
that
many,
happening.
but if I may, there are many commitments that we have made as a government that we really want to deliver,
so
but where we are hampered, we're hampered by an inheritance that has been extraordinarily poor fiscally. We will keep working towards a system for the public finances that is far more robust for the future, one where we really can be funding our priorities at the level that we want to see. But that £22 billion black hole has inevitably had a significant impact. As I said, I am pleased, I am encouraged by the fact that we've seen that uplift for 24-25 in order terms. I think that was correct. I'm pleased the Chief Secretary to the Treasury made that decision, of course, subject to parliamentary approval. But if I may, and I'm sorry that I keep underlining the point, I think the most important thing that I've heard from partners has actually not been from them about, and this genuinely is the case, it's not been from them about the exact percentage. It's been their feedback about there having been rapid change. That's what they have said was the big problem before, and that's what I'm determined to avoid.
Thank you. Monica.
I want to talk about the ambition. So this is something that we spoke to the officials about. I want to see the rhetoric which don't seem to match the fiscal rules adoption, but we'll leave fiscal rules to one side for a moment. But given there has been a UK aid cut, how will you meet your ambitions to reset the UK in the development stage?
So there previously were cuts, as I just set out for 24-25. We've seen an uplift, and for me, it really is important that we restore the UK's reputation on development. And I have to say, when I've been around the world, whether that's in kind of global summits, Paris, Hamburg, New York, DC, Baku, whether it's been in the different field visits that I've undertaken, I have heard the same phrase being said. Now, I'm not going to get overexcited about this because we've got to work hard to make sure this is sustained. But I've heard the same phrase being used back to me, and that phrase has been, we understand that Britain is back now. Now, we need to make sure that's sustained. We're absolutely determined to deliver on that. Of course, that's a cross-government determination that we would reconnect our country with the rest of the world. The Prime Minister has been clear about that. The Foreign Secretary has. And I certainly have been on development as well. That has led to the decisions that we've taken. You know, I mentioned IDA. We also doubled our support to Sudan when it comes to the humanitarian side. We've been pushing very hard on deep and thorough reform of the global financial system. For example, we made sure the World Bank has embedded climate resilient debt clauses in its lending. That was a decision taken by this government. So on those areas, we are really seeking to ensure there's UK leadership, that Britain is back, working with other countries, working hand in hand with our partners, but that we can demonstrate and renew that reputation for UK international development once more.
Minister, I'm giving you a choice. We're loving what you're telling us and we really appreciate the depth, but it is leading to long answers.
Oh,
so either could we have shorter answers or can you accept that we're going to run over the agreed time?
I mean, I don't mind, but I don't want colleagues to be put
if you
in a
don't
difficult
mind,
position.
then let's go ahead. James, can I bring you in, please?
Yes. Thank you, Minister. I just want to turn attention to in-donor refugee costs. As you will know, they've increased from 0.6 billion in 2019 to 4.3 billion in 2023, so a significant part of your department's budget is heading in that direction. We've not seen any specific plans yet about how that's going to be reduced. Are there such plans actually in development?
Absolutely. I mean, the Home Secretary has set out a whole number of plans. She hasn't just set out the plans, they're being actioned right now. I won't go into the detail of them because that would be more for the Home Select Committee, of course, Home Affairs Select Committee, but they've been particularly relevant to in-donor refugee costs, which of course cover the first year. So making sure that there's far speedier processing, for example, that we've seen, and so forth. You know, many changes that have come through really quite quickly from the Home Secretary. However, of course, we're in this committee, so you probably want to know what I've been doing on this. And I've been really determined to ensure, given that those costs are from within the ODA budget, that we are working really hard together on getting those costs down. I'm pleased to report to the committee that the Chief Secretary to the Treasury is very keen to work together with me on this. We're re-establishing an ODA board where we're going to be scrutinising this. We're going to be making sure that we're tracking progress against it. We have seen a reduction in those costs, as I mentioned before. That helped us towards that uplift. But we're really determined to make sure that the encouraging developments that we've seen, I don't want to kind of go overboard, but they have been encouraging so far, that they're sustained so that we do see that reduction.
I think we spoke to the officials beforehand. I think we were surprised as a committee to hear that they weren't really tracking the impact of the changes. So they've had that extra uplift in funds, which is a good thing, 200 to 300 million pounds, which is going towards extra project and programmes. If that was me and that's my department, I'm going to make sure that I get that next 200-300 million in 6 months' time, 12 months' time, whenever that might be. Your officials basically sounded like they weren't really tracking that. They weren't proactively working out what the likely uplift would be and then anticipating future programmes and future investments that might be possible. Is that a fair reflection of where we are? Or what are you doing with your officials to make sure that you're modelling in that anticipated uplift, which should be coming?
So I'd make two comments on that. First of all, there is considerable work going on within the department on this. I mentioned before that ODA board. Well, officials have been working together towards that to ensure that we really can use it as a mechanism to effectively scrutinise those costs to make sure that they are going down, and mechanisms are in place to track that. So that work is ongoing. But secondly, and this relates, I suppose, to the discussion that we were having previously, the most fundamental thing for me around the financial management side as a new minister has been to ensure that we avoid that kind of really turbulent situation that we saw under previous government. Now, core to that is making sure that we are confident that we are able to deliver against our multilateral commitments that we've made, in relation to the bilateral commitments that we've made, and then that we're also able to be flexible when it comes to humanitarian crises. Now, of course, on the latter, and I know the committee are very interested in this, we've been seeking to work much more on anticipatory action, insurance and so forth, so that you reduce the variability in the cost. Sorry, I need to speed up, Chair, you said that before.
No,
Sorry.
we've got a lot, as long as you want
well.
now.
Well, bless you. But on the issue of ensuring that there's kind of good value from money, if there is a change and, say, greater availability of resources, I am confident that we would be able to deal with that in a way that would represent good value for money. I'm confident about it because we've been able to be flexible. You know, for example, when it came to the additional support that we provided into Sudan, that was provided because we were able to identify areas where, for example, there had been underspend, there had been resources that hadn't been delivered for various reasons, where there was not going to be damage from doing that. So that flexibility is within the system. The reason why I mention it is just because this is part and parcel of how, in any case, the department is having to manage towards year end and to make sure we have that flexibility, particularly around dealing with humanitarian crisis situations.
Yeah, my general sense is if you've gone from 0.6 billion to 4.3 billion, we're bringing that down. There should be a lot of extra money that's coming into your department, and therefore there should be an anticipation of when that's coming in. So as long as officials are doing that, then I think that's fine. What will you do if that money doesn't come? If those costs don't come down?
Right.
How will you be flagging your concern?
So where I might slightly put your first sentence in context, I suppose, is that I do not believe it is wise to be kind of, having a wishful thinking approach to this, because I think where the UK has not been able to fulfil our commitments, that has been extremely damaging for our reputation. So I think it's really important that we have sound financial management, that we're not thinking, well, it's possible, we need to know for sure that we're going to be able to deliver on them. So I'm not going to be anticipating if I don't have very firm evidentiary grounds to do so. So, as I say, just wanted to put your first sentence in context there. We have been working across government, but particularly with the Treasury and with the Home Office on this. You will be aware that one of the foundational commitments of the new government is to ensure that we're dealing with that asylum backlog in particular, that we are ensuring that we do have secure borders.
Minister, could I,
really clear?
The question was specifically about your budget. So we understand the PR around what we're doing on border crossings and that. We've got all of that. So what I'm hearing is you're saying you're working to the budget you know you've got, and then if this money comes in, then happy days, but it's additional. Is that what you're saying?
To be fair, yes, it is. Yes, it is what I'm saying. However, the point I was trying to make was that if those changes are not made, this will not just be an issue for my department,
it'll
be a fundamental issue for the new government. That was what I was trying to say.
Thank you.
That's fine. And just finally, what's your overall impact? You've come into the department. What's your view of the overall impact of the amount of money that is being spent on in-donor and refugee costs, on the impact and the efficacy of your department now?
So I would make two remarks on that important question. First of all, I have been incredibly impressed to see the impact that UK development and aid is having around the world. Since I started 6 months ago, I've been to South Sudan, Ethiopia, Malawi, Zambia, Jordan, the West Bank, Indonesia, to see projects that we've been supporting, including to see the impact of decisions that we've taken as a new government. And time and again, I have been struck by the incredible outcomes that have been delivered through that activity. I mean, just one really quick example.
No, Minister, we love that, but that wasn't the question that James was asking.
Well, but the question perhaps intimated that it's not possible currently to be realising the kind of outcomes that we want. And what I want to say back to the committee is I genuinely believe we are delivering on our priorities, but we do need to do more.
Thank you. Thank you, Minister.
Yeah.
Sam.
Before I ask my question on financing, I'll just ask one more question on this, because I'm pleased with the work the government's is doing on COVID corruption, for example, to look at overpriced procurement. But I think most taxpayers who look at the eye-watering sums of money that are spent on asylum hotels would wonder what on earth has gone on with the procurement of those. Because if I was a hotel owner and someone was to block book my hotel for an entire year, every single bedroom at the price that we're paying, I would think I've won the lottery. So somebody is getting very rich out of those asylum hotels, but it's not the world's poorest. And I just wonder if any work has been done to look into the procurement of hotels and to understand why are we overpaying.
With respect, I think that's a Home Office question.
Okay.
Did you have questions for the Minister?
No, but it's an ODA. it's an ODA question.
Okay.
It's about the way that we're spending.
But yes.
But I mean, I'll happily ask that if we can bring a Home Office minister in, because I think
we've done that before. We can do that again.
Question to put. So we'll move the conversation on. Alternative non-ODA financing of development. So, first question really is just sort of what's the government doing to support non-ODA mechanisms for financing international development?
Yeah, brilliant. Well, I will come on to that, Chair. I hope it is consistent with the committee's remit if I mention that I personally have had discussions with Home Office ministers around this question, and I know they're switched on to it.
Minister, if you want to jump down that rabbit hole, we'll happily chase behind you.
But I'm just mentioning it so that the committee is aware that this is something that certainly I'm aware of, and I know that they are aware of absolutely, as well as the many other measures that they're already enacting. In terms of non-ODA measures, I mean, it's very clear that aid is a tiny fraction, actually, of the resources that need to be mobilised in order to enable countries to move out of poverty and in order to drive forward global growth. So we've been focused on really trying to push forward financial reform. That's included some areas where the UK has made a contribution, but where we need to see finance really stretching much further and getting where it's needed faster. There needs to be significant reform of the multilateral development banks, for example. We pushed that very hard. I'm pleased that we've seen the GCF now investing in Somalia. We've really been pushing hard on access to support for fragile and conflict-affected states. It's really good to see that moving forward. Also, as I mentioned before, in relation to the World Bank as well, and its support for those kind of countries too. We've also been seeking to do all that we can, working with the city, others in the private sector, and of course BII, around the availability of private finance and forms of blended finance. It's been incredibly important in so many different countries. It's still far too difficult, it's far too bureaucratic, but the opportunities so often really are there to deliver those jobs and growth that is so needed in many of these countries. And I think there are many elements that we've been focused on there and where we need to see change. One is around transparency. That's really important when it comes to debt too, and I know that a number of people in the committee are really concerned about the indebtedness of many LDCs at the moment. It really is important there's much greater transparency around lending, but also for countries themselves about the impact of investment, for example, related to climate preparedness. So in Hamburg at the Hamburg Sustainability Conference, we were working with the German leadership there and other partners around the big transparency initiative that they put in place around that. I think that's going to be really important. We also need to make sure there's much more voice for countries in the Global South and many of these mechanisms too. I'm absolutely delighted the Prime Minister has been pushing hard on that at UNGA and in other forums too. Of course, the Foreign Secretary has as well. We'll keep advocating for that. So I think there are a whole variety of areas, of course, trade as well, trade for development, many other areas too, taxation, technical support, where it's important UK expertise is made available, where we can deliver that change. And a big part of that, of course, again, is about that partnership, genuine, respectful partnership, understanding what it is that our partners need in order to be moving forward.
Can I push further on the debt relief? And we've had conversations about this in the past, and as you know, African countries spend 50 times every year on debt interest to the entire UK ODA budget. So this is a really important issue. What specifically is the government going to do to support debt relief? And I'm particularly thinking about commercial banks, because so many commercial banks are governed by UK banking law.
Yeah, I mean, certainly we are in a situation that is just as intense, if not more intense, for many countries as during the kind of Jubilee period. We are also in a situation where the composition of that debt, I know that the committee will be well aware of this, but where the composition of that debt is arguably far more complex, where China, of course, is a far, far bigger creditor than it was, where there's much more private lending, also where there's much more regional lending, particularly to many African countries. That means that we're in a more complex situation, but the need, as I said, is just as intense. So as the new government, we've been really pushing to say, look, how can we get that G20 process, which of course is relatively new, how can we get it to work as quickly as it needs to work with the outcomes that it needs to deliver? When I was in Zambia, I had a number of discussions with different individuals about how they felt that process had worked or not worked. There are many lessons that need to be learned. We're really focused on making sure that reform does take place and takes place quickly. I think it's right it's a G20 process, of course, because that's bringing in that broader number of countries into the net around making sure that there is proper restructuring that takes that pressure off. We also need to make sure that we're seeing things like majority voting positions, for example, more transparency being embedded in lending from the beginning. That's really important. And we've been thinking about what we can do to really push forward leadership around that. We need more transparency. As I said before, that's really important because we can't have what Mia Motley time and again has said, countries that are being hammered by the climate crisis now, which can't prepare because they're saddled by debt. We need to make sure that investment that is helping countries to prepare is not treated in the same way as investment that or spending that isn't actually delivering that outcome. And then finally, we need to make sure there are climate resilient debt clauses within lending too. Of course, I know there are many other options that have been presented on the table. I am engaging with a number of different bodies around those, as well as with the G20, as I mentioned. I have a meeting coming up with civil society to talk about some of those ideas as well. I really do think it's important we're doing as much as we can to try and remove that debt burden, because now, of course, you have a lot of countries spending much more on debt than they're spending on, for example, health and education.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Can I ask one more quick question? It's not about debt relief, but actually about tax base. And a lot of developing countries struggle because of capital flight and because tax is not paid that's owed in those countries. Is the UK government doing anything to show leadership on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is an area actually where we need to make far more of the UK contribution. We've seen HMRC in particular in a number of different countries providing support and advice at a technical level to different governments that has been really significant. And I find that myself with some of the field visits that I've done, actually speaking with government actors about the difference that that's made. Of course, we've sought to contribute advice in many other areas as well around fiscal sustainability. I was particularly keen to see that directly in operation in the West Bank when I was having discussions with the Palestinian Authority, and the work that Sir Michael Barber and others have been doing to support the Palestinian Authority there. But of course we then also need to make sure that we have overall a multilateral system that is working well, and there is that OECD process. We need to make sure that process is effective, that it's one that is preventing that kind of leaking of resource so that countries really are able to obtain the taxes they need. We also need to be stamping out, of course, kleptocracy and illicit finance at home as well as overseas, and the Foreign Secretary has made that a real campaigning and policy priority, and we're delivering on that.
Thank you. Brian.
Thank you. Minister, in order for us to understand the extent to which the eradication of extreme poverty is a priority for government, what do you see as the appropriate balance between using ODA in middle-income countries in support of diplomatic objectives and in low-income countries to combat extreme poverty?
Well, ultimately, of course, overseas development assistance must be used to relieve poverty. That is the criterion against which it must be spent. That is set very clearly in law. I think it's very important that the UK focuses on ensuring that we're enabling countries to develop jobs and growth, including the poorest countries. I think that's very, very important. And that focus for me has been absolutely critical. It's been reflected in what I've done so far as a Minister for Development in the places that I've been, in the projects that we have focused on delivering. I think when it comes to middle-income countries, often they're far more focused on the kind of issues we were talking about a moment ago. For example, sometimes technical assistance, matters to do with global reforms where we can work together on a shared reform agenda for multilateral institutions. But when it comes to the spending of ODA, I think that poverty alleviation objective is incredibly important, particularly when it comes to extreme poverty. I think you can't go to, frankly, a place like South Sudan, the kind of circumstances that people are in there, but also the opportunities that exist there, the hope that people have themselves for change, without being determined that we will ensure that we use the means available to us to be countering extreme poverty.
To keep hammering on this particular topic, a greater proportion of ODA currently goes to middle-income countries compared to low-income countries. Are there any plans to reverse this trend?
So I don't believe that's correct when we take into account multilateral spending and other forms of ODA spending and not purely bilateral. When we look at the classification of countries, and of course this is something that is contested, and we hear this message from small island developing states in particular, from some of the Caribbean countries, but also from a number of Middle Eastern countries, those which at the moment have many refugees as well. They would be classified sometimes as middle income bracket, even with the challenges that they're experiencing. But as I say, if you look across the board at ODA, I don't think that is correct. I think that's the case for bilateral spending at the moment.
Is this not, though, perhaps a good reason for thinking about how we re-establish DFID as a separate organisation from the diplomatic side, if you like, of our diplomacy and in terms of the Foreign and Commonwealth bit of the FCDO?
I mean, I think the committee would want us to ensure that we were facing up to major humanitarian challenges. I think the committee would be keen for us to do that. And But at the same time, I know the committee is keen for us to ensure we have that focused on countries where there is extreme poverty as well. You know, I think it's important that we are facing up to our responsibilities in Gaza, for example, or in Jordan or Lebanon, as well as making sure that we are doing the same when it comes to South Sudan. So I think we need to ensure that we are doing both now. Part of that necessitates clarity around ensuring that we are taking decisions around bilateral spending, you know, with the right data available, and in a way that isn't kind of purely path dependent, bearing in mind the point about not having huge amounts of turbulence, but in a way that isn't driven by political proclivities or where a certain minister might have wanted to go or whatever, that is actually driven by a clear focus on what's needed. Now, that needs to cover extreme poverty, needs to cover humanitarian concerns. It also, I would say, now needs to cover climate vulnerability as well. And those are the kinds of factors that we are looking at extremely carefully when it comes to allocating bilateral spending.
Thank you. Alice. Thanks very much. Going back to women and girls, we obviously know that when development's focused on women and girls, it is more effective. There's a statutory obligation to consider gender equality, and I emphasise the word consider because I want to come on to that. You said it was one of your priorities. When I asked the officials before about how in the past there had been quite a lot of cuts in this area, it wasn't very clear to me that there was an overall assessment of the aggregation of cuts on women and girls. So I've got one general question and then some specifics on Afghanistan. So can you just kind of elaborate on how you're going to deliver that priority, in particular how it is being embedded across the department so you're clear that we are making progress on tackling gender equality?
Yeah, thank you very much for raising that, and I really do believe it is fundamental. I don't want to labour the point that I made before, but that we recognise that unless women and girls are put at the heart of development policy, we simply will not have an effective development policy. Now, the FCDO is committed that at least 80% of bilateral aid programmes will focus on gender equality by 2030. I'm focused on us ensuring that we get to that place. I believe that we have got the plans in place to ensure that we will. In 2022, that figure was assessed as lying at 58%. But I actually think we need to go further than this. There is, and you rightly alluded to this, there's a big discussion around how exactly that funding is classified, whether we're talking about the principal purpose of funding being focused on women and girls, or whether it's a question of ensuring that women and girls' needs are considered from the beginning. My view is the default must always be that women and girls are considered from the beginning, because I do not believe we can have effective humanitarian delivery or delivery of economic development or deliver for health and education and so forth unless we have that consideration from the start. So, for example, when it came to the support that we provided in relation to refugees from Sudan, particularly in Chad, we've sought to ensure that there was that really strong focus on preventing conflict-related sexual violence, which has been, such a huge concern for refugees from Sudan. Again, we've made sure with the education programmes that we've been working on as a new government, the needs of girls are always considered there.
I'm just conscious of time. Can I just kind of push a little bit on the consideration versus the primary objective? Because my understanding at the moment is that the ODA spending on gender equality is where it has a focus, not necessarily the primary objective. So are you considering kind of changing that so actually there is a target for the primary objective of ODA being gender equality, not just a focus within it?
I would say the most important thing for me is to make sure that mainstreaming is not just a word, that it is a reality. And I mean that very, very seriously, that with every proposal that I'm looking at, I'm determined to ensure that we really are taking this seriously. I want to know what's changed compared to not having that commitment. That's what's important to me. Okay. But secondly, when it comes to programmes that are focused specifically on women. We've been seeking to work particularly on the issue of women's rights organisations and making sure that we're supporting them. Now, that was a particular focus of my visit to South Sudan. It has been in some other countries as well that I visited, because we recognise the kind of catalysing impact that those women's organisations can then have on so many other outcomes as well.
Just one more point, and let's just move quickly to Afghanistan. So in terms of the empowerment of women and girls, is this still going to be funded through individual programmes rather than having a kind of general empowerment, if you like, a Goal 5 fund in the department? In terms of the funding and prioritisation, is it still kind of, and it might be both, but mainstream through individual programmes, or would you consider something more central, you know, a fund, I don't know, for women and girls within DFID? FCDO.
So there are kind of discrete programmes that are focused specifically on women and girls. For example, as I said, women's rights organisations, but also in relation to, for example, you know, women's health in particular, and other areas. You mentioned Afghanistan, I think, at the beginning.
I'm going to come on to that in a minute.
Oh, okay, sorry. Right.
Okay,
yeah.
Fine. So just on Afghanistan, obviously you mentioned it at the beginning, and we have seen horrific, you know, I think it's been described as the worst abuse of women's rights in the world. There are, of course, what is happening there to be recognised as gender apartheid, and a push for that to be codified within international law. Does the government, would you describe it as gender apartheid, and do you support those moves?
Yeah, I mean, you're right to describe the situation in Afghanistan for women and girls in the terms that you used. It's absolutely horrendous, and I think the recent measures that were brought in around healthcare staff are extremely disturbing, clearly not just for those women who no longer will be able to train as nurses and doctors, but for the impact then that's going to have on women's access to healthcare. It's absolutely appalling. There is that international discussion around exactly how the Taliban's behaviour should be categorised. There are very different points of view around that internationally, including from South Africa, but from other nations as well. For me, the absolutely critical thing is what we can do to try and change this appalling situation for women and girls. That means making sure that we are engaging internationally on these questions. It also means, of course, that we are doing what we can to support women and girls, and that means ensuring that when it comes to the humanitarian crisis that there is in Afghanistan, that we don't see through UK programming at any time that there is a deprioritisation of women and girls. Same when it comes to health and education as well. And I've pushed really hard on that since I've been a new minister, to make sure that we're really confident with those who are delivering that provision, that they are themselves confident that there will always be that provision for women and girls in what they're doing. For example, we know that now girls are not allowed to attend secondary school. Well, we shouldn't see support for boys to attend secondary school, in those circumstances. That kind of measure is really clear in our approach.
I think I was just on the specifics, and we might to follow up. I think it feels to me that obviously it's very difficult to do lots of things, and there is this real push around using international humanitarian law. There was the draft global treaty on targeting crimes against humanity, and I suppose I'm trying to understand, does the UK support moves to include gender apartheid within that? There are also, I can't remember which countries are trying to bring Afghanistan under FCDO to the court. Does the UK support that? Because those to me feel like very tangible things that we could show that we are supporting with international law, that will also show women in Afghanistan that we're on their side.
Yeah, I agree, and we do support those moves in relation to FCDO. When it comes to the inclusion of gender apartheid as a new crime against humanity, as I mentioned before, there are quite complex considerations around this. We are looking really carefully at them, and there are quite different points of view, as I said, including from South Africa. So we are looking really carefully at this, but above all, seeking to do all we can to try and change that situation.
Thank you. Laura.
Thank you. And so I'd like to turn to the situation in the occupied Palestinian territories, which, as you know, remains absolutely dire, and in particular UNRWA, which in 3 weeks' time, the legislation that's gone through the Knesset is due to come into force, which would effectively ban UNRWA from operating, and almost 6 million people across the Middle East are reliant on UNRWA for the very basics of essentials in healthcare. Is your assessment that it's likely that law will be implemented by Israel in 3 weeks' time, and how worried are you?
I'm very concerned. It's very clear that no other organisation is able to deliver aid and services to people, not just in Gaza, but of course right across the region, in the way that UNRWA does. No other organisation has got the scope that it has, the depth of provision, but also, of course, there's a UN mandate for UNRWA to be performing the task that it has been, of course, for many decades. It's a critical task, and I saw that for myself when I was in the West Bank. I visited an UNRWA-run school there. I've spoken a number of times with the leadership of UNRWA, of course, Secretary General Lazzarini, but also with his deputies as well, including when I've been in Jordan. And we are absolutely crystal clear on the fact that UNRWA has that mandate. It must not be countered. Yes, there has been that vote in the Knesset, in the Parliament in Israel. We've been clear that vote cannot be implemented. It must not be. To do so will be to go against that UN mandate, but also to cause tremendous suffering to people, not just in Gaza, but across the whole of the region. So we are deeply concerned about this situation. And as you would expect, I've talked in detail about this with NGOs, but I've also raised it, as you would expect, when I was in Israel itself, and I made this very clear to the Israeli government, to Israeli parliamentarians, that there is no alternative to UNRWA continuing its important work.
Is the Israeli government listening? Do you feel your representations are being taken seriously and considered?
I think that there clearly was considerable concern in Israel, especially after the issues that led to the Clonner review. I think there was deep concern about the allegations of involvement of UNRWA staff in the October attacks. But the UK government, the new UK government, has been in a lot of contact with UNRWA since those events, really seeking both to understand what they've been doing, especially on the neutrality reforms that they've been taking forward. And we've also kind of put our money where our mouth is, because we've ensured that process has been supported by the UK. We believe that was what was necessary, and that has led to change within UNRWA around neutrality, and there is simply no alternative to UNRWA within both Gaza and the West Bank, other parts of the region as well. As I said, no other organisation that can deliver the life-saving support that they provide.
But what does happen if this does go ahead, if Israel goes ahead? Are you confident they have looked at alternatives? Do they think there are alternatives that could work? It feels highly unlikely to me, but from our perspective, how's that going to play out the day after this does go into force, if it does?
Yeah, I mean, our view remains that it must not go into force, that there is a very clear mandate for UNRWA, that its work is absolutely necessary. We do not believe that there has been a clear alternative that has been set out, even if there were somehow a justification for that. We don't believe that there is, so there has not been an alternative that has been set out. The ultimate upshot could potentially be an extremely severe impact on many people who are already in dire humanitarian straits, and we'll continue to make that very clear.
Minister, could I intervene? We're very grateful for all that you're doing on this, and I know that you really care about this. But you didn't answer. Do you believe that Israel is listening to the pressure that you're trying to apply?
I mean, I certainly had very long conversations with those individuals that I met in Israel. I made very clear the UK government's position on this.
Which is what?
well, as I said, that the role of UNRWA must be continued, that we cannot see an implementation of that decision. I also made clear that and this, of course, I don't want to rerun the discussion that happened in the House earlier today, but there cannot be impediments on aid and all the other issues that, of course, the UK government has focused on and has pressed hard on, not just with Israel, but, of course, bilaterally with other countries too and multilaterally as well. I think it is important that we continue to engage, that we continue to push really hard on these matters, because I think we know what the impact will be if we don't.
You're drifting off again. So do you think... I'm sorry, I'm a big fan, but I'm doing my job. Minister, do you think Israel is listening both about UNRWA when you're trying to apply pressure, but also about the other things that are going on within the region?
Well, we must see a change in position, ultimately. We have to see that change. We have to see a change around removing support for UNRWA. We have to see a change around the impediments to aid access. And, of course, that is consistent, absolutely, with the government's position that there must be a ceasefire, the release of all hostages, and, of course, the surge of aid into Gaza that was promised.
Of course,
so we have to see that change, and we will keep arguing for it.
You have to see that change, or what? Because the American government put down a very clear, red line about the number of trucks that had to go in and the date, and then that didn't happen, and there were no consequences to that. So what you're saying about UNRWA, they have to change. Well, yes. But you haven't said that you believe the Israeli government are listening when you're saying that, and you haven't said what consequences there are going to be if they don't. Because the consequences will be no aid will be able to get into Gaza. That will be from day one.
So we have, and again, I don't want to rerun the discussion earlier in the House. As a new government, we have been very clear that, for example, we believe the ICC, the ICJ have jurisdiction when it comes to events in Gaza. We have taken a radically different approach when it comes to arms export licensing. Obviously, a radically different approach when it comes to UNRWA as well, compared to the previous government. We will continue to push really hard on these issues because we can see frankly, the humanitarian catastrophe that's unrolling within Gaza at the moment. And hopefully members of the committee will have seen that we've been working internationally on this, particularly at the UN Security Council, of course, recently, but elsewhere as well. I was in Egypt for the Gaza Humanitarian Conference that they held in November, where we were seeking to work with other countries on this. If I may, Chair, just one quick word, however, on the point that you made at the beginning. And I discussed this at length when I was in West Bank, but also with a number of UK-based NGOs that have been active within Gaza. I think it's really important that we're focused on the outcomes for people in Gaza at the moment. We see those now when it comes to healthcare, nutrition levels, availability of shelter, and the impact of a lack of shelter. We can see those statistics right now. I think when it comes to measuring the number of trucks and so forth, actually, to me, that measure, given that we've seen so much change around what pallet height is allowed, all this kind of thing, where they're allowed into, and so forth. For me, that isn't the core measure. The core measure is the status of people actually within Gaza at the moment.
Thank you, Laura.
Yeah, no, and I do agree. The measure ultimately has to be about delivery in terms of where the aid gets to, but that feels to me like UNRWA is an essential part of that. There is no alternative. And I do, I fear that this ban will go ahead and will be implemented. I worry also about the impact on other UN agencies. And just my final question to you would be on that is, you hear of other agencies and UN agencies feeling similar pressures and not quite such tight restrictions explicitly yet. But do you fear a slippery slope? Where does this leave the UN more widely in the occupied Palestinian territories and in the Middle East?
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's very important that both humanitarian principles and, of course, international humanitarian law are held to, but also that UN system, which is, ultimately one for which there is a mandate from every country, that it is maintained. And You're absolutely right that we're seeing that pressure. I would also mention, without, sorry, Chair, wanting to go on a tangent, that what we've seen in Yemen in relation to UN staff, a lot of them country-based staff, but other humanitarian staff as well, also represents a crossing of the Rubicon in terms of them being taken hostage by the Houthis. So I do think it's really important we're clear about the need to hold to those principles and to continue to support that UN system. Yeah.
Actually, it was to come back to your point. If I may push it, has the UK laid out any consequences or planned any consequences to UNRWA being unable to operate anymore in 3 weeks' time? And similarly, is the Minister or is the government having any bilateral conversations with other countries about this?
Yes, so we have laid out what the consequences will be if there will be that kind of a fulfilment of that Knesset vote. We've been very clear about the likely impact. I've been clear about it bilaterally, as we were talking about before, with Israel, but with other partners as well, a number of different countries that we've been working with around the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, from countries in the Gulf, other countries in the region, to the US, many other nations that we've been working with on this. And of course, we've had those discussions with UN agencies and with NGOs as well. So we absolutely have been clear about the potential impact and about the need to work together in relation to that impact. But you know, we're very clear that there isn't some kind of an alternative that can just be switched on for UNRWA, that the international community could just come up with. That alternative does not exist, because there is no body that, as I said before, has got that scale of operation that UNRWA has, nor indeed the depth of operation that it has as well.
Minister, we really are pushing it on time now. I've just asked broadcast if we can extend, but hopefully we don't have to go into that. But I know that this is an area that you really care about, which is Sudan, and David would like to ask you some questions on it, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. We're delighted that the UK envoy for Sudan has been appointed, but we previously had evidence in front of this committee that there was a concern that they perhaps weren't operating yet at pace, and just wondered your reflections 4 months on from that person being in post, what your expectations are for the role and how it can help the UK's response to the humanitarian crisis that we have.
Yeah, so I'll try and be really quick. I was really pleased that they were appointed. We've now seen the first UK engagement in Port Sudan to have taken place since the conflict began. I think that was incredibly important that happened. We, of course, have doubled our aid to Sudan, and we're continuing to work with a range of other bodies, bilaterally, multilaterally as well, on what we can do to face up to what's arguably the biggest humanitarian crisis in terms of the number of people who've been displaced.
Wow, thank you.
No, I think it's Samuel.
No, I attend, which is just about what the UK is doing to support atrocity prevention strategies in Sudan and refugee host countries.
Yeah, so we worked with other nations to make sure that the UN's fact-finding mission was renewed. I was really pleased that we saw additional African countries coming in to back that. It's very, very important that the mandate was renewed, so there is that fact-finding. We're also supporting work that's ongoing through social media and elsewhere to gather information about those atrocities.
Do you want some? No, you couldn't pass that to the Minister, could you? Minister, why don't we just give you a moment, and we really do appreciate how much time you're giving to us now, and we also really appreciate how passionate you are about this, and apologies for roughing you up a little bit, but we also care very much about this topic, and I'm very blessed as a committee that I think we're completely full of people that have a background in development and the associated fields, so yeah, I'm very fortunate as a chair to have such expertise this side of the table. Sam?
Yeah, there was a follow-up question. probably one for a longer answer another day, but the previous government established that there should be an atrocity prevention strategy. So what's the government doing to make sure that there's an atrocity prevention strategy and that's being integrated into foreign and security policy going forward?
Yeah, so I'll try and answer this quickly before I start coughing again. Sorry, I think I've got a bit of a frog in my throat. I know this is an area the committee is really concerned about, and particularly that the UK is doing all that we can so that the alarm is sounded as well where necessary. Sorry. Yes, I can keep going. So that is a priority for us as well. And we will work hard on it. Sorry, Chair, I'm struggling a bit here.
No, it's all right. Minister, the US have just determined that RSF are committing genocide in Darfur and have announced a set of heavy sanctions. Do you think that this is something that we're likely to follow suit on? We'll take nods and sign language.
Yeah. So we'll certainly examine that very carefully.
Yes, we've got lozenges as well.
Oh, amazing! Thank you.
Barton is the best chair and has a bag full of literally everything that you might need.
Oh, brilliant! Yeah, we'll certainly look very closely at that determination.
Thank you very much, Noah.
Thank you. Moving to another big topic with a big number attached. So for the UK to meet our £11.6 billion commitment to the International Climate Fund, the government needs to deliver 3.4 billion in 25 to 26 alone. So is the FCDO on track to deliver this currently?
Yeah, thanks very much for that question. I believe that we are on track to deliver that. I think that is also related to the fact that currently so much development work is intimately connected with particularly climate adaptation as well as mitigation. For example, if we're to look at the situation in Zambia, where I recently visited, the kinds of measures that we've been putting into place to make sure that farmers are better able to adapt to the climate crisis. There's the drought that's been taking place. That's clearly something that is very important climate-wise, but it's also going to be supporting them economically. It's absolutely fundamental to their autonomy and to the development of local economies too, when they're able to, for example, be purchasing a broader range of grain. They need to do that because there unfortunately is more drought. There needs to be more climate resilience crops, but that can then create more opportunities for local traders and so forth. So I am confident we're going to deliver that, but I think that is both because of a conscious focus on delivering it, but also because so much of what's needed for development now and poverty alleviation is intimately connected with the impact of the climate crisis.
So I think this is probably something that the public are quite concerned about as well. I certainly myself receive a lot of correspondence about this number. But do you think that am I correct in understanding what you're saying is that this is something of a fungible number rather than a standalone commitment? It's very much being met via commitments made elsewhere in ODA?
No, I wouldn't read that implication from what I said. What I was trying to underline was that when the Foreign Secretary said that climate and nature would be at the heart of everything we do, that was both because we will have explicit targets around this and we'll have explicit programmes around it, but also because the drivers of extreme poverty and brakes on economic development at the moment are so often now ultimately connected with the climate crisis and indeed the nature crisis as well.
Okay. And which areas of ODA spend do you think have to be deprioritised for us to meet those commitments? I will press you on this. I know that you said that they are so very linked, but ultimately, if this is kind of a standalone fund or commitment that we're making, and it's detracting perhaps from ODA as a whole, then what has to give?
I mean, I have to say that I haven't. I suppose this relates again to that point about partnership that we were talking about before. I don't believe that we've been in a position where we've had to say, related to the priorities that I set out at the beginning, that we cannot pursue those priorities because we have to hit that target. I don't think we've been in that situation. Instead, I would say what we've needed to do is both to try and push as hard as possible for greater access to, particularly to climate finance for the poorest countries, where it's not getting there quickly enough, where we've been doing all that we can to push for reform. But also, within other areas of programming, we've needed to make sure that we are considering environmental matters. And I'm not trying to say that there's never any kind of challenge here, but if you, again, to go back to the case of South Sudan, the same children whose schools were flooded because of the climate crisis in the rainy season are the kids who are unable to work in those schools because they're too hot in the dry season. Now, unless that issue is faced up to, you can be putting funding into education, but unless you're drawing both those issues together, you're not going to have those children getting the educational benefit that's necessary. So you have to consider them together.
And perhaps drawing very briefly, if you can, on a question that David asked earlier and many others have, do you think we are articulating that clearly enough to the public?
I think we can always do better. Certainly I, as a politician, always believe I need to do more to make sure that I'm communicating as clearly as I can. I'm learning from others around this. But, I mean, when it comes to that particular example, I think it's very intuitive for people to understand. I mean, my kids, without going into too much detail, they thought they were going to have a snow day yesterday morning. They didn't get a snow day. They would have loved to have had a snow day and get the day off school. And the average kid in the UK may have about 7 days perhaps off school because of weather events, maybe normally many fewer than that. The average child in many of the countries that are under extreme climate stress will be seeing weeks and weeks and weeks of the year when they can't be in school because of these climate stresses. And I think that's something that's very intuitive, actually, and that people have a huge amount of concern around.
Okay, maybe just finally, appreciate this is something you may have to come back in writing about, but if you could get us a number as to how much reclassification of existing ODA is required to meet that spend, would be very grateful for that.
I don't think we're talking about a reclassification. Sorry, we're not talking about a change of the rules. We are determined to make sure that we are meeting our commitments around this. I suppose what I was trying to underline, just to go back to the point again, is that the impact of the climate crisis now on people's life circumstances is so intense that it has to be at the heart of a huge amount of what the department does on development anyway. Yeah.
Thank you. Two very quick questions, one from David.
Thank you, Chair. Minister, thank you for being so generous with your time. So the last wave of questions will focus on the oceans. So the government has committed to ratifying the Global Ocean Treaty. But when does it plan to do this?
Well, that can be a quick answer because we're determined to ratify. We're moving forward at pace. Of course, there is quite a lot of technical work that needs to be undertaken, but we're really determined that we will be ratifying as soon as possible. It is something that's of great importance, both to me as a development minister, but also to Foreign Secretary as well.
Can I push you on a date?
You can push me. You won't get one. But that's not because we're not working at pace and really hard on this. And we've been, of course, liaising really intensively with our DEFRA colleagues on this. They want to be moving forward on this as quickly as possible. I know that it's a real priority, certainly for this government, but it's also a priority for many of those countries that are particularly impacted by these issues too.
Broadly, this half of the year, next half of the year?
Look, I want us to do it as quickly as possible. We're working at pace, but there is there's quite a lot of technical work that needs to be gone through in order for us to ensure that when ratification happens, that it's actually going to be delivering that impact.
But it will be this year?
I want it to happen as soon as possible.
Nice try. My colleague knows there's a Global Ocean Conference in March, and it would be very nice to go there and reassure particularly the SIDS that we are committed to this. Because it's somewhat frustrating that we haven't ratified it yet, but we hear what you've said. Minister, last question, which is, just forgive me, it's quite a controversial one because the last government handed over a lot of money to Rwanda and obviously the M23 have been involved in atrocities over there. So what due diligence have you done to make sure that none of that money has fallen into those people's hands?
Yeah, I know that Lord Collins, who of course is the Minister for Africa, he has visited Rwanda, he's also visited Angola and DRC as well. It's extremely concerning to see the situation that is developed within DRC, of course. And I have been seeking to ensure that our development spending, I mean, wherever it is in the world, that it is actually delivering on our objectives and being used in a way that actually supports people who are in need of that support, rather than falling into hands that it shouldn't be within. That will, I'm sure, be the case here as well. And certainly when it comes to our engagement on these questions, I know that Lord Collins has been urging Rwanda, but indeed the other countries as well that are engaged here, really trying to push them to adhere to the peace process that is taking place. Of course, there's also multinational forces that are involved, as well as the UN too, really trying to ensure that we can get a resolution of what is an incredibly complicated conflict now, with so many different armed groups all operating. But of course the overall impact is a terrible one on the people of DRC. So yeah, thank you very much for raising it. And if I may, particularly now that I'm feeling restored, thank you so much for the lozenges and no longer spluttering. I really hope I haven't given it, whatever it is, to others.
We will track you down, Minister.
But
I mean, you think we get cross about odour, but if you're giving us your bugs, it's a whole other level.
But it's been a real pleasure, and I really did genuinely appreciate the engagement of the committee before I went to the West Bank previously. It's been wonderful to have this conversation now. I know this committee has so much development expertise within its ranks and from the forces and lots of other areas as well that are so important. So thank you, everybody, and I look forward to many other such meetings. I hope if you'll have me back.
We certainly will. I think we've got you in front of us in a month, Minister.
Yeah, good.
We'll be a regular slot in your diary. Thank you very much. You've been incredibly fulsome and open with us. It makes for a very good relationship, and it enables us to scrutinise and do our job properly. Thank you for all that you're doing. Thank you for all of the time today. Thank you for your team being here as well. Order. This session is now closed.